We've all felt invisible at some point in our lives. We've all known what it's like when people look right through us like we don't matter. In the spring of 1873, Mary Ellen Graves stood alone at the Pine Hollow Town dance, wearing her only dress, a faded calico that marked her as the poorest widow in the county. The townsfolk whispered and turned away. No one would dance with her. Then the door opened and Silas Boone walked in. He was the mountain man who lived beyond the timberline, quiet and strong. He crossed that floor and stopped before Mary Ellen. He extended one rough hand. What happened next changed everything that town believed about worth and dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The spring evening air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the open windows of Pine Hollow's community hall. Lanterns hung from the rafters, their warm light casting dancing shadows across the polished plank floor that the carpenter boys had spent all afternoon waxing until it gleamed. The fiddle player, old Samuel McCreary, sat in the corner tuning his instrument while his grandson readied the banjo. In another hour, when the sun dipped behind the western peaks, the annual spring dance would begin in earnest. Mary Ellen Graves stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her hands folded carefully at her waist. The calico dress she wore had once been a cheerful yellow, bright as butter, but 6 months of wear and repeated washing had faded it to the color of old parchment. The hem had been let down twice, and if you looked closely, you could see where she'd carefully mended a tear near the collar with thread that didn't quite match. She'd pinned her dark hair back as neatly as she could manage, though she had no ribbons to weave through it, like the other women. At her throat, hidden beneath the high collar, hung the only piece of jewelry she still owned, her late husband's wedding ring on a thin chain. She hadn't wanted to come. The thought of standing here, of facing the women who used to invite her to quilting circles and the men who used to tip their hats with genuine warmth, filled her with a dread that sat heavy in her stomach. But something stubborn in her refused to disappear entirely, to let them forget she existed just because fortune had turned against her. Around her, Pine Hollow's citizens arrived in their finest. Mayor Hutchins came through the door with his wife on his arm. Both of them dressed in clothes ordered from a catalogue in Denver. Mrs. Adelaide Finch swept in wearing a new dress of deep green silk, her 3 daughters trailing behind her like ducklings, each one primped and pressed until they shone. The Carpenter family arrived as a boisterous group. The parents and their 5 children ranging from little Sarah, who was barely 7, up to Thomas, who'd just turned 18 and was already taller than his father. Evening. "Mary Ellen," Mr. Carpenter said as he passed, touching his hat brim. His wife offered a small smile, genuine but brief, before ushering the children toward the refreshment tables being set up along the far wall. "Good evening," Mary Ellen replied. But they were already moving away, caught up in the swirl of greetings and conversation. She remembered other spring dances. Just 2 years ago, she'd arrived with James, her husband, both of them laughing about something he'd said on the walk over. He'd been a good dancer, light on his feet despite his stocky build, and he'd made sure her cup was never empty and that she never sat out a single tune. They hadn't been wealthy, not by any stretch, but James had steady work at the mill, and they'd had a small house on the edge of town with a garden plot that Mary Ellen tended with care. They'd been comfortable. They'd been happy. Then the fever came through that autumn, swift and merciless. James lasted 4 days before the light went out of his eyes. The doctor's bills came first, then the burial costs. Then came the revelation that James had borrowed money from Mr. Blackwell to invest in mill equipment, certain it would pay off in the spring. The debt fell to Mary Ellen, and when she couldn't pay, the house went to settle it. She'd sold nearly everything else, furniture, cookware, James's tools, just to cover what remained. Now she lived in a single room above Pemberton's general store, working whatever job she could find. She cleaned the boarding house 3 days a week. She took in mending when anyone would give it to her, though most of the town ladies had stopped coming by. She stretched every penny until it screamed, ate one proper meal a day if she was lucky, and tried to maintain some scrap of dignity in a town that had already decided her fate. "Is that Mary Ellen Graves?" Mrs. Finch's voice carried across the room, pitched just loud enough to be heard by her immediate circle, but designed to travel further. "I'm surprised she'd show her face here. That dress looks like it's been through a decade of hard use." Her daughters tittered obligingly. Mary Ellen kept her eyes fixed on the far wall, her face carefully neutral. She'd learned not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. The fiddle began to play, a warm-up tune that Samuel always used to limber his fingers. The banjo joined in, and soon couples were forming on the floor. Mayor Hutchins led his wife out first, as was tradition, and then others followed. The music swelled, filling the hall with the kind of joy that made you forget for a moment how hard life could be on the frontier. Mary Ellen stayed in her corner near the refreshment table. She told herself she would stay for 1 hour, show the town she hadn't been broken, and then slip away before the dancing got too spirited. But watching the couples spin and sway, seeing the children dart between the adults' legs, hearing the laughter ring out, it all pulled at something deep in her chest. Young Tommy Bradford approached the refreshment table, a gangly boy of 16, with ears that stuck out and a cowlick that refused to be tamed. He glanced at Mary Ellen, then at the punch bowl, then back at Mary Ellen. For a moment she thought he might speak to her. "Thomas Bradford, you get over here right now." His mother's voice cut through the music. Mrs. Bradford stood with Mrs. Finch, both women staring at Tommy with expressions that could freeze water in July. Tommy's face reddened. He grabbed a cup of punch, mumbled something that might have been an apology, and hurried away. Mary Ellen took a slow breath. This was a mistake. She should leave now, before the humiliation deepened. She could slip out the side door, walk back to her room, and no one would even notice her absence. She was turning to go when the main door opened. The evening light behind him turned the man to a silhouette at first, broad-shouldered and tall, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending more time with mountains than with people. As he stepped fully into the hall, the lantern light revealed Silas Boone in more detail than most folks in Pine Hollow had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet, with a frame built from years of hard labor. His face was weathered by wind and sun, lined in the way of men who squint against bright snow and summer glare. His hair, dark brown, shot through with gray, was tied back simply. He wore a shirt that had once been good quality, but now showed the wear of practical use, and trousers tucked into boots that had walked more miles of wilderness than most people would travel in a lifetime. Dust still clung to his coat. The conversation in the hall didn't stop exactly, but it shifted. People noticed. Silas Boone rarely came to town, perhaps 4 or 5 times a year for supplies, and he'd never attended a social gathering in the decade since he'd built his cabin high up near the timberline. "Well, I'll be," Mayor Hutchins said to no one in particular. "Silas Boone at a dance. Never thought I'd see the day." Silas stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes moving across the room with the careful attention of someone accustomed to noting details. His gaze passed over Mayor Hutchins, over Mrs. Finch and her whispering circle, over the couples on the dance floor. Then his eyes found Mary Ellen. She felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. She'd seen him before, of course, everyone in Pine Hollow had, but always at a distance. He'd nod to the shopkeepers when he came for supplies, pay cash for what he needed, and leave without unnecessary conversation. She'd heard the stories about him, the speculation. Some said he'd been a soldier. Others claimed he was running from something back east. A few romantic souls insisted he'd lost a great love and come to the mountains to heal his heart. Whatever the truth, Silas Boone was watching her now. He began to walk across the floor. Not hurrying, but with clear purpose, his boots making solid sounds on the polished wood. The dancing couples parted without thinking about it, creating a path. The fiddle continued playing, but Samuel's eyes were on Silas like everyone else's. Mary Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't imagine why he was coming toward her. Perhaps he needed something from the refreshment table. Perhaps he was going to ask her to move, tell her she was in the way. Silas stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were grey, she noticed, the colour of winter clouds, and there was something in them that made her think of deep water, quiet on the surface, but with currents running underneath. He didn't bow or smile or offer any of the social niceties that usually preceded such moments. He simply extended his right hand toward her, rough and calloused. The hand of a man who split his own firewood and built his own shelter and asked nothing from anyone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly hushed hall. "May I have this dance?" Mary Ellen stared at the offered hand for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a heartbeat. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was this some kind of joke? Had someone put him up to it? But when she looked into Silas Boone's face, she saw nothing but straightforward sincerity. He was simply asking her to dance. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mr. Boone." "Why not?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious, as if he couldn't fathom a single reason why dancing with her would be problematic. Around them, the music had faltered. Samuel McCreary's bow hovered above the strings, and his grandson had stopped playing the banjo entirely. Every eye in the hall was fixed on this unlikely pair. "People are watching," Mary Ellen said quietly, acutely aware of Mrs. Finch's scandalized expression, of Mayor Hutchins' raised eyebrows, of the way conversations had died mid-sentence all across the room. "Let them watch," Silas said simply. His hand remained extended, steady as a rock. "I came here tonight to dance with you, Mrs. Graves. I'd be obliged if you'd say yes." There was something in his voice that made her believe him. He hadn't wandered in randomly and decided to make a charitable gesture. He'd come here deliberately, with intention, knowing exactly what he meant to do. Her hand trembled as she reached out and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, and she felt the calluses earned from a lifetime of honest work. For the first time in 6 months, someone was choosing to touch her, not out of necessity or obligation, but simply because they wanted to. Silas led her onto the dance floor. The crowd parted further, creating a circle around them. Mary Ellen felt her face flush hot with embarrassment and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Samuel," Silas called to the fiddle player. "How about that waltz you used to play?" "The one in 3/4 time." Samuel blinked, then a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "I know the one." He lifted his bow, nodded to his grandson, and began to play. The music was gentle, sweet, the kind of tune that made you think of first loves and spring mornings. Silas placed his other hand carefully at Mary Ellen's waist, proper and respectful, and began to lead her through the steps. At first, Mary Ellen was stiff with self-consciousness. She stumbled over her own feet, certain she was making a fool of herself. But Silas was patient, his lead clear and steady, and gradually her body remembered the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They began to move together, finding a shared cadence. "That's it," Silas said softly, for her ears alone. "You're doing fine. I haven't danced since—" She stopped herself. The grief still too close to the surface. "I know," he said, and somehow she believed that he did know, that he understood loss in ways that didn't require explanation. They circled the floor once, twice. Mary Ellen became aware that other couples were beginning to join them, taking the periphery of the circle, giving them space, but filling the floor again. The dance was continuing, life was continuing, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Why? Mary Ellen asked finally, the question that had been burning in her throat since the moment he'd appeared before her. "Why did you come here tonight? Why me?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering his words the way a careful man considers his steps on uncertain ground. "I've seen you in town," he said eventually. "Noticed how folks treat you. It didn't sit right with me. You don't know me," she said. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you show up to work every day with your head high, even when people turn their backs. I know you say please and thank you to Mr. Pemberton, even when you're counting out your last few coins. I know you helped Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries to her wagon last month when her arthritis was bothering her, and she didn't have a kind word for you after." Mary Ellen's throat tightened. She hadn't realized anyone had been paying attention, least of all someone like Silas Boone, who seemed to exist on the margins of town life. "Those are small things," she managed to say. "Small things are how you measure a person's character," Silas said. "Big gestures are easy. It's the small kindnesses, the ones nobody's watching for. Those are what matter. The waltz wound to its conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like the last light before sunset." Silas stepped back, releasing her hand, and Mary Ellen felt the loss of that contact like a physical chill. But before she could return to her corner, before the evening could return to what it had been, Silas offered his hand again. "One more?" he asked. Mary Ellen looked around the hall. Mrs. Finch was whispering furiously to her circle, her face pinched with disapproval. But Mayor Hutchins was smiling, and his wife was too. The Carpenter children were watching with open fascination, little Sarah's eyes as wide as saucers. Mr. Pemberton stood near the refreshment table, with his arms crossed. But there was something approving in his expression. "One more," Mary Ellen agreed. Samuel struck up another tune, this one livelier, and suddenly Silas was guiding her through a reel. Mary Ellen laughed, despite herself, a sound that surprised her because she couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed with genuine joy. Silas didn't smile exactly, but his eyes crinkled at the corners, and she thought maybe that was his version of laughter. They danced through that tune, and then, when it seemed natural to continue through another, other couples filled the floor now, the evening returning to its proper festive atmosphere. But Mary Ellen was aware that people were still watching, still taking note of the fact that Silas Boone, the hermit of the high country, had chosen to spend the evening dancing with the poorest widow in Pine Hollow. During a brief pause between songs, Mrs. Finch materialized at Mary Ellen's elbow. "Mrs. Graves," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How unexpected to see you dancing, and with Mr. Boone, of all people." "Evening, Mrs. Finch," Silas said before Mary Ellen could respond. His tone was perfectly polite, but there was something in it that made the older woman take a step back. "I simply meant," Mrs. Finch began, but Silas had already turned back to Mary Ellen, effectively dismissing the town gossip as if she were no more significant than a buzzing fly. "Getting warm in here," he observed. "Would you like some air?" Mary Ellen nodded, grateful for the escape. Silas offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation she took it. They walked through the hall toward the side door that opened onto a small porch. Mary Ellen felt the weight of stairs following them, heard the whispers that kicked up in their wake. But with Silas beside her, steady and unbothered, she found she cared less than she had before. The evening air was cool and fresh after the warmth of the crowded hall. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The music from inside filtered out through the open windows, softer now, a backdrop rather than a demand. "Thank you," Mary Ellen said, turning to face Silas, "for tonight. For what you did in there. You didn't have to." "Maybe not," Silas agreed. "But I wanted to." He leaned against the porch railing, looking out toward the dark shapes of the mountains rising in the distance. "This town's got itself twisted up about who matters and who doesn't. Somebody needed to remind them they're wrong." "They'll talk about this for weeks," Mary Ellen said. "About you and me. They'll make it into something it's not. Let them talk." Silas's voice was calm, unbothered. "Talk doesn't hurt me none. Question is, does it hurt you?" Mary Ellen considered this. A few hours ago, the thought of being the subject of town gossip would have filled her with dread. But something had shifted tonight. Silas had seen her, really seen her, when everyone else in Pine Hollow had been looking right through her. That changed things in ways she was only beginning to understand. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it does." They stood together in companionable silence, listening to the music and the night sounds of the frontier. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills, and another answered. The wind moved through the pine trees, with a sound like distant water. "I should walk you home," Silas said after a while. "Getting late. "You don't have to do that," Mary Ellen protested, though part of her hoped he wouldn't listen. "I know I don't have to," Silas said. "But I'm going to anyway." "Come on." They went back inside long enough for Mary Ellen to collect her shawl, thin and worn, but better than nothing against the spring chill. The dance was in full swing now, couples whirling across the floor, children darting between the adults, laughter rising and falling like music itself. For a moment, Mary Ellen let herself feel part of it again, let herself remember what it was like to belong to a community. As they headed for the door, old Samuel McCreary caught Mary Ellen's eye. He was playing a quick tune, his fingers flying over the fiddle strings, but he managed to wink at her. Then he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, pressing it into her hand as she passed. "You hold on to that, Mrs. Graves," he said kindly, "in case you need it." Mary Ellen looked down at the square of cloth, plain white cotton but clean and carefully pressed. Only then did she realize her eyes were wet with tears she hadn't felt forming. They weren't tears of sadness exactly, or even of joy. They were tears of relief, of release, of being seen and acknowledged as a person who mattered. "Thank you, Mr. McCreary," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a good woman." "Mary Ellen," the old man said, "don't let anybody tell you different." Outside, the night had settled in fully. The moon was rising over the eastern ridge, 3/4 full and bright enough to cast shadows. Silas walked beside her through the dirt streets of Pine Hollow, matching his longer stride to her shorter one without making a show of it. They passed the general store where Mary Ellen's room waited above, dark and empty. They passed the mill where James had worked, silent now for the night. They passed the church with its simple white steeple pointing up toward the stars. "You really live all the way up past the timberline?" Mary Ellen asked, breaking the silence. "Most of the year," Silas confirmed. "We got a cabin up there. Built it myself about 10 years back." "Why so far from everything?" Silas was quiet for a moment, and Mary Ellen, worried she'd overstepped, asked something too personal. But then he spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I spent some years back east," he said. "During the war and after. Saw a lot of things I didn't care to see. Lot of people being cruel to each other for no good reason. When it was over, I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere clean. The mountains offered that. Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But lonely's different from alone. I don't mind being alone. What I can't stomach is being around folks who've forgotten how to treat each other decent." They had reached the general store. A single lamp burned in the window. Mr. Pemberton signaled that he was still awake, probably doing accounts in the back room. The exterior stairs that led up to Mary Ellen's room looked rickety in the moonlight, though they were sturdier than they appeared. "This is me," Mary Ellen said, unnecessarily. Silas nodded. He stood there, hat in his hands now, looking at her with those steady grey eyes. "Mrs. Graves, I want you to know something." "Yes?" "You ain't poor," he said softly but firmly. "Not where it counts. Not if you still got a heart like that." Mary Ellen felt fresh tears threatening. "I don't have much," she said. "I don't have anything, really." "You got dignity," Silas said. "You got kindness. You got strength enough to walk into that dance hall tonight, even knowing how they'd treat you. That's worth more than all the money in Blackwell's bank." He settled his hat back on his head and took a step back. "I'll be checking on you, if that's all right. Make sure you're doing okay. You don't have to—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "But I'm going to anyway. Good night, Mary Ellen." He turned and walked away, his footsteps steady and sure in the darkness. Mary Ellen watched until he disappeared around the corner, heading back toward wherever he'd left his horse. Then she climbed the stairs to her room. Samuel McCreary's handkerchief still clutched in her hand, and for the first time in 6 months. She went to sleep with something that felt like hope warming her chest. The morning sun found Mary Ellen at the boarding house, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. The work was hard, and the pay was modest, but it was honest, and Mrs. Patterson, who ran the place, didn't treat her with the disdain that some others in town did. The older woman was simply practical. She needed help, Mary Ellen needed work, and personal circumstances didn't enter into the equation. "You're humming," Mrs. Patterson observed from the doorway, her arthritic hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Mary Ellen paused, realizing it was true. She couldn't remember the last time she'd hummed while working. "I suppose I am. Heard about last night," Mrs. Patterson said, settling herself carefully into her chair by the window. "The whole town's talking about it. Silas Boone dancing with you, walking you home." Mary Ellen felt her cheeks warm. "People need to find better things to occupy their time." "Maybe so," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "But you can't blame them for being surprised. Silas hasn't shown interest in anyone since he came here, and you've been keeping so quiet, so to yourself, that folks forgot you're still a young woman with a life to live." "I'm 32, Mary Ellen said. "Hardly young. You're younger than me by 3 decades, girl, so don't talk to me about being old." Mrs. Patterson took a sip of her coffee. "What I'm saying is, it's good to see you lifting your head again. James wouldn't want you spending the rest of your days in mourning." The mention of her late husband brought the familiar ache to Mary Ellen's chest. But it was softer now, more like an old bruise than a fresh wound. "No," she said quietly. "He wouldn't." She finished the floors and moved on to the dining room, where she'd need to set the tables for the noon meal. The boarding house catered to traveling salesmen, circuit preachers, and the occasional family passing through on their way to somewhere else. It was steady work, if not glamorous. When she finally finished her shift and stepped out into the midday sun, she found a package waiting on the bottom step. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple twine, no label or note attached. Mary Ellen looked around, but the street was empty, save for a dog sleeping in the shade across the way. She carried the package up to her room and set it on the small table by the window. For a moment she just looked at it, almost afraid to open it. Gifts were not something that came her way anymore. Finally, she untied the twine and folded back the paper. Inside was a wooden box, hand-carved with a simple but elegant design of pine branches around the lid. The wood had been sanded smooth and oiled until it glowed warm in the light. Mary Ellen ran her fingers over it, marveling at the craftsmanship. Someone had spent hours making this. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in clean cloth, was fresh venison, a good 3 pounds of it, carefully butchered and still cool to the touch. Beneath the meat was a small bundle of dried herbs and a paper twist of salt. There was no note, but Mary Ellen didn't need one. She knew who had left this. Her first instinct was to refuse it, to find Silas and return the gift, because accepting it felt like charity, and she'd already endured enough pity from this town. But as she sat there looking at the box and its contents, she realized this wasn't pity. This was something different. This was someone seeing a need and meeting it without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. This was kindness. She spent the afternoon preparing a proper stew with the venison, letting it simmer slowly with the wild onions she'd gathered from the field behind town and a few precious carrots she'd been saving. The smell that filled her tiny room was rich and nourishing, the scent of a real meal, and her stomach growled in anticipation. That evening, after she'd eaten her fill and packed the rest away for tomorrow, there was a knock at her door. Mary Ellen opened it to find Mr. Pemberton standing there, looking uncomfortable. "Evening, Mrs. Graves," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I wonder if I might have a word." Of course, Mary Ellen stepped back to let him in, suddenly self-conscious about the humble state of her room. But if Pemberton noticed or cared about the spare furnishings and worn curtains, he gave no sign. "I'll be direct," he said. "I've been thinking about your situation. You're a good tenant, always pay your rent on time even when I know it's not easy. You're quiet, clean, never any trouble." "Thank you," Mary Ellen said, uncertain where this was leading. "The thing is, my wife's been after me to do more around the store. Her hands aren't what they used to be, and we could use help with inventory, keeping the shelves stocked, maybe helping customers when it gets busy." He cleared his throat. "I'd like to offer you additional work. Few days a week, decent pay. If you're interested." Mary Ellen felt something loosen in her chest. More work meant more money, which meant a bit more security, a slightly softer cushion against disaster. "I'm very interested, Mr. Pemberton, thank you." He nodded, clearly relieved to have the conversation done. "Start Monday, then. Morning shift, 8 to noon." He turned to leave, then paused. That was a good thing Silas Boone did last night. Reminded some folks in this town about their manners. After he left, Mary Ellen sat by her window and looked out at the darkening street. Change was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather shifting. That electric sense in the air before a storm, or the particular quality of light that promises snow. She thought about Silas in his mountain cabin, wondered what his days were like up there in the high country. Did he spend his evenings looking down at the valley, the way she spent hers looking up at the mountains? Was he thinking about her the way she was increasingly thinking about him? The week passed in a new rhythm. Mary Ellen worked her shifts at the boarding house and began her new position at Pemberton's General Store, where she discovered she had a knack for organization and a good memory for where things were kept. Mrs. Pemberton was kind in her practical way, showing Mary Ellen the systems they used and trusting her to manage on her own after just a few days. The town's reaction to her continued to shift in subtle ways. Some people remained cold. Mrs. Finch and her circle still whispered when Mary Ellen passed, still made their disapproval known through pointed looks and deliberate exclusion. But others began to soften. Mrs. Carpenter stopped by the store and made a point of asking Mary Ellen's advice about fabric for a new quilt. Young Tommy Bradford held the door for her at the boarding house and stammered a greeting. It was as if Silas's simple act of dancing with her had given others permission to remember she was human. On Thursday afternoon, Mary Ellen was restocking the shelves in the back of the store when she heard the bell over the door jingle. She emerged to find Silas standing at the counter, his presence seeming to fill the small space. "Afternoon," he said when he saw her. If he was surprised to find her working there, he didn't show it. "Mr. Boone," Mary Ellen replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her heart had kicked up its pace. "What can I help you with today?" "Need some coffee beans," he said. "And I'm low on lamp oil." Mary Ellen moved through the store, gathering the items. She was acutely aware of Silas watching her, though his gaze wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply attentive, the way he seemed to pay attention to everything. "I wanted to thank you," she said as she measured out the coffee beans, "for the venison and the box. It was too generous." "It was practical," Silas corrected. "I had meat to spare, and you needed food. No generosity about it, just common sense." "Still," Mary Ellen insisted. "Thank you." He nodded, accepting her gratitude without making a fuss over it. When she'd tallied his purchases, he paid in cash. She noticed he always paid in cash, never on credit like so many others in town. And then he stood there for a moment as if deciding something. "Sunday's coming," he said finally. "I was planning to attend church service. Thought maybe you'd like to sit together." Mary Ellen's hands stilled over the counter. Church was the most public gathering in Pine Hollow, even more so than the dance had been. Sitting together in a pew would make a statement, would give the gossips even more to talk about. "I don't have a proper church dress," she said quietly, voicing the worry that had been keeping her from services for weeks now. Silas looked at her steadily. "God don't care about dresses, Mary Ellen. He cares about what's in your heart. And from what I've seen, your heart's just fine. People will talk." "They're already talking," Silas pointed out. "Might as well give them something real to talk about." He picked up his purchases. "I'll save you a seat. Up to you if you fill it." He left before she could respond, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him as if this were just an ordinary transaction, as if he hadn't just offered to publicly align himself with the poorest woman in town in front of the entire congregation. That evening, Mary Ellen stood in front of her small mirror and looked at her reflection. The face that looked back was thinner than it had been a year ago, with new lines around the eyes and mouth. But there was something different there now, something that hadn't been present in the hollow days after James's death. There was determination, there was possibility, there was the faint, fragile beginning of something that might, eventually, become happiness again. She thought about Silas's invitation, about what it would mean to accept it. Then she thought about standing in her corner at the dance, invisible and dismissed, and how Silas had crossed that floor and extended his hand. He had chosen to see her when everyone else had looked away. The least she could do was be brave enough to be seen. Sunday morning, Mary Ellen put on her faded calico dress, the only dress she owned, and pinned her hair back with extra care. She tucked James's wedding ring under her collar as always, a talisman against loneliness, and stepped out into the bright spring morning. The church bell was ringing, calling the faithful to service. Mary Ellen walked through town with her head high, feeling the weight of curious stares but refusing to hurry or hide. When she reached the church steps, she paused for just a moment, gathering her courage, and then she climbed them and pushed open the door. Inside, the pews were filling up. Mayor Hutchins and his wife sat in their usual spot near the front. The Carpenter family took up an entire row. Mrs. Finch and her daughters clustered together like a flock of green-dressed birds. And there, in a middle pew on the left side, sat Silas Boone. He'd saved the space beside him, his hat resting on the bench to mark it as occupied. When he saw Mary Ellen, he picked up the hat and nodded to the empty seat. Mary Ellen walked down the aisle, feeling every eye in the church following her progress. The whispers started immediately, a rustle of sound like wind through dry leaves. But she kept her focus on Silas, on that saved seat, on the simple fact that someone wanted her there. She slid into the pew beside him. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," Silas replied. "Glad you came." Reverend Morgan took his place at the pulpit, looking out over his congregation with the benevolent expression of a shepherd surveying his flock. He was a good man, Mary Ellen had always thought, genuinely kind rather than performatively pious. "Before we begin," the Reverend said, "I'd like us all to reflect on the scripture that tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Not just the neighbors who look like us, or who have as much as us, but all our neighbors. The widow, the stranger, the poor among us, these are the ones we're called to uplift, not cast aside." His eyes swept over the congregation, lingering for just a moment on Mrs. Finch's section, then moving to where Mary Ellen sat beside Silas. "Let us remember that God sees the heart," he continued, "not the dress someone wears, or the size of their home, or the balance in their account. He sees what we do when nobody's watching, how we treat the least among us. That's where our true character shows." It might have been a standard sermon on charity, the kind Reverend Morgan delivered periodically to keep his flock mindful of their Christian duty, but Mary Ellen couldn't help feeling it was also, perhaps, a pointed message to certain members of the congregation who'd been particularly unkind in recent months. Beside her, Silas sat still and attentive throughout the service. He had a good singing voice, Mary Ellen discovered during the hymns, a rich baritone that rose clear and true. When it came time to pray, his head bowed with genuine reverence, not the show of piety that some displayed. After the service ended, the congregation filed out slowly, pausing to chat on the church steps and in the yard. Mary Ellen steeled herself for the gauntlet of stares and whispers, but Silas remained beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. "Mrs. Graves, Mr. Boone," Mrs. Carpenter's voice carried over the crowd. She was making her way toward them, her family trailing behind. "We're having Sunday dinner at our place. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and vegetables, but we'd be pleased if you'd join us." Mary Ellen looked at the woman in surprise. Dinner invitations had dried up months ago, leaving her to eat her simple meals alone in her room above the store. "That's very kind," she began, ready to decline out of habit. But Silas spoke up. "We'd be honored," he said. "Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Carpenter." "Wonderful," Mrs. Carpenter beamed. "Come by around 1 o'clock, and please call me Eleanor." As the Carpenters moved away, Mary Ellen turned to Silas. "You didn't have to accept. I'm sure you have better things to do than sit through a Sunday dinner." "Can't think of anything better," Silas said simply. "Besides, pot roast sounds a sight better than the beans I was planning to make." They walked together through town, back, toward the store where Mary Ellen would need to change and collect herself before dinner. The spring air was warm, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers from the meadows beyond town. "This is all happening very fast," Mary Ellen said, voicing the thought that had been circling in her mind all week. "A week ago I was invisible. Now people are inviting me to dinner, treating me like I matter again." "You always mattered," Silas said. "They just forgot. Sometimes people need reminding." "And you appointed yourself to do the reminding?" He was quiet for a moment. "I saw something I couldn't walk past," he said finally. Simple as that. But Mary Ellen was beginning to understand it wasn't quite that simple. Silas Boone had chosen to step out of his solitary life in the mountains for a reason, and that reason had something to do with her. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, opening up possibilities she'd thought were closed to her forever when James died. At her door, Silas paused. "I'll come by at 1:45. We can walk to the carpenter's together." "All right," Mary Ellen agreed. She watched him head off down the street, then climbed the stairs to her room. Inside, she sat on her bed and let out a long breath, processing everything that had happened. Her world was shifting, the ground under her feet becoming something new and unfamiliar. But for the first time since James's death, unfamiliar didn't feel frightening. It felt like possibility, and that, Mary Ellen thought, might be the most surprising gift of all. The Carpenter home sat at the eastern edge of Pine Hollow, a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch and a yard where chickens pecked contentedly in the dirt. When Silas and Mary Ellen arrived at 1:15, Silas had been precisely on time, Mary Ellen noticed. They found the family in a cheerful chaos that spoke of a house full of life and love. "Come in, come in." Eleanor Carpenter ushered them through the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Don't mind the noise. Sunday dinners around here tend toward the rowdy side." The dining room table had been extended with extra boards to accommodate everyone. The 5 Carpenter children ranged themselves along one side. Thomas at 18, then Margaret at 16, followed by Daniel at 13, Ruth at 10, and little Sarah, still just 7 but convinced she was much older. John Carpenter sat at the head, carving the roast with practiced efficiency, while his wife brought out bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh-baked rolls that steamed when you broke them open. "Mr. Boone, you sit there," Eleanor directed, pointing to a chair near John. "And Mary Ellen, you're next to Sarah. She's been asking about you all morning." Sarah beamed up at Mary Ellen with the unself-conscious adoration of a young child who'd decided someone was wonderful. "You wore the prettiest dress at the dance," she announced. "I told Mama I want a yellow dress just like it when I'm grown up." Mary Ellen felt her throat tighten. She'd been so conscious of her dress being old and worn, but Sarah saw only the color, the simple beauty of it without the weight of judgment. "That's very sweet, Sarah, though I'd want ribbons too," Sarah continued thoughtfully. "Do you like ribbons, Mrs. Graves?" "I do," Mary Ellen said. "Very much." The meal was abundant and delicious, the kind of simple but hearty food that filled both stomach and soul. John Carpenter asked Silas about hunting in the high country, and the 2 men fell into an easy conversation about game trails and weather patterns. Eleanor engaged Mary Ellen in talk about the store, asking her opinion on which fabrics might sell well as summer approached. "It's good to have your eye for these things," Eleanor said. "You've always had fine taste, Mary Ellen. I remember the tablecloth you embroidered for the church sale a few years back. Most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." The comment brought back memories of better times, when Mary Ellen had hours to spend on needlework and the leisure to make beautiful things just for the joy of it. "I sold all my embroidery supplies," she said quietly, "after James died. Had to." Eleanor reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry for what you've been through. It wasn't right how some folks treated you. Wasn't Christian at all. Some people don't know how else to react to misfortune," Mary Ellen said, trying to be charitable. "They're afraid it might be catching." "That's fear talking," John Carpenter interjected, setting down his fork. "And there's no excuse for it. This is a hard land, and we're supposed to look out for each other. That's how we survive." Young Thomas, who'd been mostly quiet during the meal, cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize, Mrs. Graves, for the dance. I should have asked you to dance, but He glanced at his parents, then continued. I let my mother's friends tell me what to do, instead of doing what I knew was right. You mean Mrs. Bradford? Eleanor asked pointedly. Thomas nodded, looking miserable. I'm sorry. You're forgiven, Mary Ellen said gently. We all make mistakes, especially when we're young. What matters is learning from them. That's exactly right, John agreed. Takes courage to admit when you're wrong, son. I'm proud of you for doing it. The conversation moved on to other topics, the upcoming planting season, news from the territorial capital, speculation about whether the railroad might eventually come through Pine Hollow. Throughout it all, Mary Ellen found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since before James's death. This was what she'd been missing, the easy fellowship of a shared meal, the warmth of friendly company, the sense of belonging somewhere. She noticed Silas watching the family with something thoughtful in his expression. When little Ruth asked him if he ever got lonely up in his cabin, he considered the question seriously before answering. Sometimes, he admitted, but I've got my work and the quiet suits me. Still, days like this remind me what I'm missing. You should come down more often, Daniel suggested, with the straightforward logic of a 13-year-old. Then you wouldn't be lonely. Maybe I will, Silas said. And his eyes moved to Mary Ellen. Seems like there might be reason to. After dinner, while Eleanor and Margaret cleared the table, Mary Ellen helped with the washing up in the kitchen. Through the window, she could see Silas in the yard with the younger children, showing Daniel something about tracking. She could see him pointing to marks in the dirt, explaining what they meant. He's good with them, Eleanor observed, following Mary Ellen's gaze. Natural with children. That's a rare quality in a man who's chosen to live alone. He's been very kind to me, Mary Ellen said carefully. I'm grateful. It's more than kindness, Eleanor said, handing Mary Ellen a plate to dry. Anyone can see that. The question is, how do you feel about him? Mary Ellen was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said finally. It's only been 6 months since James died. Sometimes I feel guilty for even thinking about... She stopped, unable to finish the thought, about being alive. Eleanor supplied gently. About wanting companionship? About maybe eventually finding happiness again? She set down the pot she was scrubbing and turned to face Mary Ellen. James was a good man. I know you loved him, but he's gone, and you're still here. You're allowed to keep living. Some would say it's too soon. Some would say all manner of foolish things, Eleanor said firmly. You know your own heart, Mary Ellen. Don't let other people's opinions tell you what you should feel or when you should feel it. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. By the time they returned to the main room, Silas was teaching Sarah how to identify different kinds of tree bark, his large hands gentle as he showed her the samples he'd pulled from his pocket. You carry tree bark around with you? Margaret asked, laughing. Never know when you might need to identify something, Silas said seriously, though Mary Ellen thought she detected a hint of humor in his eyes. Out in the wild, knowing your trees can mean the difference between safe shelter and a dangerous place. Tell us about bears, Daniel begged. Have you ever fought a bear? Fighting a bear is about the stupidest thing a man can do, Silas replied. The key is not fighting them, it's avoiding them or making sure they avoid you. Most bears want nothing to do with humans if you give them a choice. He launched into a story about tracking a bear through the high country, keeping the details light enough for the children, but engaging enough to hold everyone's attention. Mary Ellen watched him, seeing a side of Silas she hadn't glimpsed before. He was comfortable here, able to move between solitude and society more easily than his reputation suggested. When it was finally time to leave, Sarah hugged Mary Ellen fiercely. Will you come back? She asked. If your parents invite me, Mary Ellen said, looking to Eleanor. Consider the invitation standing, Eleanor said warmly. Sunday dinners or any other time. Our door is open. Outside, the afternoon had mellowed into that golden light that comes before evening. Silas and Mary Ellen walked slowly through town, neither of them in any hurry to end the day. That was nice, Silas said. It'd been a long time since I sat at a family table like that. Me too, Mary Ellen agreed. I'd forgotten what it felt like. They reached the general store and Mary Ellen paused at the base of her stairs. The afternoon had been so pleasant, so normal, that she was reluctant to let it end. "Would you like to come up for coffee?" she asked, then immediately worried it was too forward. "I don't have much to offer, but—" "Coffee would be fine," Silas said. Her room looked even smaller with Silas in it, his presence seeming to fill the space. But he didn't comment on the sparse furnishings or the way the curtains had been mended multiple times. He simply removed his hat and waited while she put the coffee on the small stove. "I need to head back up the mountain tomorrow," Silas said. "Got some repairs to make before the summer season. Probably be gone a week or so." Mary Ellen tried not to show her disappointment. In just a few days, she'd grown accustomed to the possibility of seeing him, the knowledge that he was nearby. "But I was thinking," Silas continued, "when I come back, maybe I could bring you up to see the high country, show you where I live. If you'd be interested." Mary Ellen looked at him in surprise. "You'd want me to see your cabin?" "I don't invite many people up there," Silas admitted. "Truth is, I don't invite anyone up there. But I'd like you to see it. See where I spend my days. Understand that part of my life." "I'd like that," Mary Ellen said softly. "I'd like that very much." The coffee boiled, and she poured it into two mismatched cups, the best she had. They sat at her small table, knees nearly touching in the cramped space, and talked as the afternoon light shifted toward evening. Silas told her more about his cabin, about the meadow nearby, where elk grazed in the mornings, and the stream that ran cold and clear, even in the height of summer. Mary Ellen found herself telling him about her childhood, about growing up the youngest of 4 sisters, about how she'd met James at a church picnic and known within an hour that she wanted to marry him. "You must miss him," Silas said quietly. "I do," Mary Ellen acknowledged. "Every day. But it's different now than it was right after. The grief isn't as sharp. It's more like," she searched for the right words, "like an old ache. You know it's there, but you can live with it." "That's good," Silas said. "Means you're healing." When the light outside had faded to purple dusk, Silas stood to leave. At the door he paused, his hand on the frame, and looked down at Mary Ellen. "I'm glad I went to that dance," he said. "Glad I crossed that floor." "So am I," Mary Ellen whispered. After he left, Mary Ellen stood at her window and watched him walk away through the darkening streets. Tomorrow he'd be gone, back to his solitary mountain life. But he'd be back. And when he returned, she'd go with him to see the high country, to see the place he called home. It was strange, she thought, how quickly life could change. A week ago, she'd been invisible, dismissed, alone. Now she had work, she had friends again, and she had what? She wasn't ready to call it love, not yet. But it was something precious and fragile that deserved careful tending. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Mary Ellen pressed her hand against the window glass, feeling the coolness of it against her palm, and allowed herself to hope. The week passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Mary Ellen worked her shifts at both the boarding house and the general store, and while she couldn't say everyone in Pine Hollow had warmed to her, the outright hostility had lessened. People nodded when they passed her on the street. A few even stopped to exchange pleasantries about the weather or ask after her health. Mrs. Finch and her circle remained stubbornly cold, but Mary Ellen found she cared less than she might have expected. Their disapproval was a distant thing, unable to touch her the way it once had. On Wednesday morning, as Mary Ellen was sweeping the front steps of the boarding house, a horse and rider appeared in the distance. Even from far off, she recognized the set of Silas's shoulders, the easy way he sat in the saddle, as if he and the horse were parts of the same creature. Her heart lifted despite her attempt to remain composed. He'd said he'd be gone a week, but here he was, after only 3 days. Silas dismounted in front of the boarding house, looping his reins over the hitching post. He carried a small wooden box in his hands, similar to the one he'd left for her before, but smaller, more delicate. "Morning," he said, touching his hat brim. "Finished my repairs quicker than I thought." "That's good," Mary Ellen said, setting her broom aside. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him how the days had felt longer in his absence, but that seemed too revealing. "Made something for you," Silas said, holding out the box. Thought you might have use for it. Mary Ellen took the box carefully. The wood was pale pine, smoothed and oiled until it glowed softly. The lid had been carved with a simple pattern of wildflowers: columbine and Indian paintbrush, mountain lupine and wild rose. Each flower was rendered with careful detail, the kind of work that took patience and steady hands. "Silas," she breathed, running her fingers over the carved surface. "This is beautiful. You made this yourself?" "Carving helps pass the long winter evenings," he said, almost apologetic. "Thought you might use it for keeping personal things. Documents, letters, whatever you want to keep safe." Mary Ellen opened the lid. Inside, the box was lined with cedar to keep moths away. It was the kind of gift that showed thought, care, attention to what someone might actually need rather than what looked impressive. "I don't know what to say," Mary Ellen said. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "It's enough," Silas assured her. "Listen, I've got to pick up supplies from Pemberton's, but I was wondering, are you free tomorrow afternoon? Thought we might take that ride up to the high country if the weather holds." "I can arrange it," Mary Ellen said quickly. "Mrs. Patterson won't mind if I adjust my schedule." "Good, I'll come by around noon. Bring a warm shawl. It gets cooler up in the elevations." He left to complete his errands, and Mary Ellen carried the box upstairs to her room. She set it on her table and simply looked at it for a long moment. This beautiful thing made by someone's hands specifically for her. Inside, she carefully placed the few precious items she still owned: James's letters from their brief courtship, her marriage certificate, the deed to the house they'd lost, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. That evening, as Mary Ellen was closing up at the general store, Mr. Pemberton called her into the back room. She went with some trepidation, worried she'd done something wrong. But the store owner's expression was friendly. "Been meaning to talk to you," he said, settling himself on a stool near the inventory shelves. "You've been doing good work here, Mary Ellen, better than I expected, if I'm honest. You've got a head for numbers and an eye for what sells. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. I enjoy the work." "That's good. That's real good." He pulled at his moustache, a habit Mary Ellen had learned meant he was thinking. "Thing is, Mrs. Pemberton's arthritis is getting worse. Doc says she needs to rest her hands more, not be on her feet so much. We've been talking, and we'd like to offer you more hours. Maybe even 4 days a week instead of 2. Mary Ellen's breath caught. More hours meant more money, which meant more security, a little cushion against disaster. "I'd be very grateful for that, Mr. Pemberton. There is one thing, though." He looked uncomfortable. "Some of the ladies in town, Mrs. Finch's set, you understand, they've been saying things about you and Silas Boone, about it being improper, you spending time with him when you're a widow and all." Mary Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger mixing with embarrassment. "We've done nothing improper." "I know that, and most sensible folks know that too," Pemberton said quickly. "I'm just giving you fair warning that there's talk. Wanted you to hear it from a friend, rather than have it blindside you." "I appreciate that," Mary Ellen said, though her jaw was tight. "But I'm not going to stop spending time with Mr. Boone because of gossip. He's shown me more kindness than most of this town has in the past 6 months." "Good for you," Pemberton said, and he sounded genuinely pleased. "Stick to your guns, Mary Ellen. The right people will stand by you, and the rest aren't worth worrying about." Mary Ellen walked home through the spring evening, thinking about what Pemberton had said. She knew there would be talk, had known it from the moment Silas first asked her to dance. But understanding it intellectually and confronting it directly were different things. What bothered her most wasn't the gossip itself, but the presumption behind it, as if she wasn't capable of making her own choices, of determining her own path. As if she needed Mrs. Finch and her friends to tell her how to live her life. Back in her room, Mary Ellen looked at the carved box again, at the careful detail work. The hours Silas must have spent creating something just for her. This man who lived alone in the mountains, who needed nothing from anyone, had taken the time to make her something beautiful because he'd thought it might bring her pleasure. That mattered more than all the gossip in Pine Hollow. The next day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring morning that made you believe in new beginnings. Mary Ellen wore her most practical dress, still worn, still faded, but sturdy enough for riding, and tied her hair back with her only ribbon, a bit of blue cloth that had seen better days. When Silas arrived precisely at noon, he brought a gentle mare for her to ride. "This is Daisy," he said, stroking the horse's nose. "She's got a calm temperament. Won't give you any trouble." Mary Ellen approached the mare slowly, remembering how to behave around horses from her childhood. She'd grown up around animals, had ridden regularly before coming to Pine Hollow, but it had been years since she'd been in a saddle. Silas helped her mount, his hands steadying her as she settled herself. His touch was brief but careful, and Mary Ellen was aware of the strength in those weathered hands, the gentleness with which he treated her. They rode out of town, heading east, toward the mountains that rose blue and imposing in the distance. The trail climbed gradually at first, winding through foothills covered in sage and juniper. As they gained elevation, the vegetation changed. More pine trees now, their scent sharp and clean in the air. Silas kept the pace easy, checking occasionally to make sure Mary Ellen was comfortable. They didn't talk much at first, simply riding in companionable silence, but Mary Ellen found herself acutely aware of everything around her. The call of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of wind through pine branches, the particular quality of light at this elevation, brighter and more intense than down in the valley. After an hour's ride, they stopped beside a small stream to water the horses. Mary Ellen dismounted with Silas's assistance, her legs a bit shaky after so long out of practice. "You're doing fine," Silas observed. "Most people who haven't ridden in years would be complaining by now." "I'm enjoying it too much to complain," Mary Ellen said truthfully. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is up here." They shared the simple lunch Silas had packed: bread, cheese, dried apples, and cold water from the stream that tasted better than anything from a well. Sitting on a sun-warmed rock beside the water, Mary Ellen felt something settle in her chest, a peace she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. "My cabin's another 2 hours from here," Silas said. "But there's something I wanted to show you first." He led her up a narrow trail that climbed steeply through dense forest. The horses picked their way carefully over rocks and roots, their breath coming harder in the thin air. Just when Mary Ellen thought they couldn't possibly go any higher, they emerged into an alpine meadow. The sight stole her breath. The meadow stretched out before them, a carpet of wild flowers in every color, yellow and purple and red and white, swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond the flowers, the mountains rose even higher, their peaks still capped with snow despite the spring warmth. The sky overhead was an impossible blue, so bright it almost hurt to look at. "Oh," Mary Ellen said inadequately. "Oh, Silas, thought you'd like it," Silas said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "This meadow blooms different every year, depending on the winter snowpack and spring rains. This year's been good for the flowers." They dismounted and walked through the meadow, careful not to trample the blooms. Mary Ellen knelt to examine a cluster of columbines, their delicate blue petals perfect miniatures. Nearby, Indian paintbrush added splashes of vivid red. She'd seen pictures of such places, read descriptions in books, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. "Could I—" she hesitated, then continued. "Could I pick a few? To press and keep?" "Course you can," Silas said. "Take what you want." The meadow's generous. Mary Ellen selected flowers carefully, choosing the best specimens: a columbine, a paintbrush, several lupines, and a delicate white flower she didn't recognize. Silas watched her, his expression soft. "What's this one called?" she asked, holding up the white flower. "That's Western Bistort," Silas said. "Blooms early season. You can eat the roots if you're hungry enough, though they're better boiled." They spent an hour in the meadow, Silas pointing out different plants and explaining their uses, Mary Ellen drinking in the beauty and the knowledge. He knew this land intimately, she realized, understood it in ways that came only from patient observation and genuine love. As they prepared to remount, Silas pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. "For your flowers," he said. "Keep them from bruising on the ride back." Mary Ellen wrapped her precious blooms carefully in the cloth. Later, she would press them between the pages of her Bible and keep them in the carved box. Physical proof that this day had happened, that this beautiful place existed. The ride back to town took them through different country, Silas choosing a route that showed her more of the landscape. They passed a beaver dam, the industrious animals' work evident in the downed trees and carefully constructed pond. They saw elk grazing in a clearing, the animals lifting their heads to watch the riders pass before returning to their meal. As Pine Hollow came into view below them, Mary Ellen felt an unexpected reluctance to return. Up in the high country, she'd felt free in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The town meant work and responsibility, gossip and judgment. The mountains meant possibility. "Thank you for today," she said as they rode down the final stretch into town. "It was wonderful. We'll go again," Silas promised. "Whenever you want. The mountains will always be there." When they reached the general store, Silas helped her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary, and when Mary Ellen looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Mary Ellen," he said quietly, and it was the first time he'd used just her given name, without the Mrs. Graves attached. "I want you to know what we've got here, whatever this is becoming. It's real for me. I'm not playing games or trying to rescue you out of pity. I see you, and I like what I see." Mary Ellen's heart hammered in her chest. "I see you too," she whispered. He nodded, as if that settled something important between them. Then he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Mary Ellen standing on the street with flowers wrapped in his handkerchief and hope blooming warm in her chest. Upstairs in her room, she carefully pressed the wildflowers between pages of her Bible, then placed the book in the carved box. These things, the box, the flowers, the memory of the meadow, they were treasures more valuable than gold. Tomorrow she'd return to her work, to the routines and responsibilities of life in Pine Hollow. But today she'd seen something beyond the valley walls. Today she'd been reminded that the world was bigger and more beautiful than she'd let herself remember. And today a good man had told her he saw her. Really saw her. That night Mary Ellen slept better than she had in months, dreaming of mountain meadows and wildflowers, of clear streams and endless sky. Sunday arrived warm and gentle, the kind of spring morning that promised summer wasn't far behind. Mary Ellen dressed for church with more care than usual, taking time to press her worn calico and arrange her hair as neatly as she could manage. She might not have fancy clothes or ribbons, but she had pride, and that was something no one could take from her. Silas met her at the bottom of her stairs, and they walked to church together through streets bathed in golden light. Mary Ellen noticed the looks they drew, some curious, some disapproving, some openly supportive. She kept her head high and her hand light on Silas's arm. At the church they took their usual pew, the one that had become theirs through 2 Sundays of habit. The carpenters waved from their row, and little Sarah blew Mary Ellen a kiss that made her smile. Even Mayor Hutchins nodded a greeting, his expression approving. Mrs. Finch and her daughters, however, made a show of turning away, their disapproval evident in every line of their rigid backs. Reverend Morgan's sermon that morning was about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman whom everyone shunned, but to whom Jesus offered living water. His words rang clear through the small church. "Our Lord didn't care about this woman's past," the Reverend said, his voice carrying conviction. "He didn't care that society had marked her as unworthy. He saw her thirst, not for water, but for acceptance, for dignity, for hope. And he offered her all 3. He paused, letting his words settle. "I wonder how many times we walk past people thirsting for simple human kindness. How many times we judge based on circumstances rather than character. How many times we forget that every single person, no matter their station, deserves to be seen and treated with dignity." Mary Ellen felt Silas's hand find hers in the pew between them, his fingers laced with hers, warm and solid, and she held on tight. After the service, as they stood on the church steps, Eleanor Carpenter approached with a smile. "We're having dinner again today," she said. "Same invitation as last week. Both of you if you're free." "Actually," Silas said before Mary Ellen could respond, "I was hoping to show Mary Ellen more of the high country today. Maybe take her up to the cabin. if that's all right with everyone." A beat of silence followed his words. Mary Ellen understood the significance of what he was suggesting. A young widow, spending an entire afternoon alone with a man at his remote cabin. It was exactly the kind of thing Mrs. Finch would seize upon as proof of impropriety. But Eleanor Carpenter simply smiled wider. "That sounds lovely. The weather's perfect for it. You two enjoy yourselves." "Eleanor!" Mrs. Bradford hissed from nearby, her expression scandalized. "Surely you're not condoning—" "I'm condoning two adults making their own choices," Eleanor said firmly. "Mary Ellen's free to spend her time however she sees fit, and Silas is a gentleman." "I see no issue," Mrs. Bradford sputtered, but Eleanor had already turned back to Mary Ellen. "Take some of these rolls for your ride," she said, pressing a cloth-wrapped bundle into Mary Ellen's hands. "They're better warm, but they'll keep well enough." As they walked away from the church, Mary Ellen heard Mrs. Finch's voice rising in agitation behind them. "It's absolutely shameless. A widow, spending time alone with a man in the wilderness. What will people think?" "Let them think what they want," Silas said quietly to Mary Ellen. "Question is, what do you want?" Mary Ellen took a breath, feeling the weight of the decision. Going with Silas to his cabin would give the gossips exactly what they wanted: fuel for their talk, evidence of impropriety. But refusing would mean letting Mrs. Finch dictate her choices, letting fear of judgment constrain her life. "I want to see your cabin," she said clearly. "I want to see where you live." Silas's face broke into a genuine smile, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his weathered features, made him look younger, lighter. "Then let's go." They collected the horses and headed east again, climbing into the mountains along the trail they'd taken before. But this time, at the fork where they'd turned toward the meadow, Silas led them higher, up a steep trail that switchbacked through dense forest. The ride took nearly 3 hours, and by the time they emerged into a clearing, Mary Ellen's muscles ached and her face was flushed from the exertion. But the ache was good, the kind that came from using your body properly, and the view before her made every moment of effort worthwhile. Silas's cabin sat in a protected hollow, backed by tall pines that would shelter it from winter winds. The structure was simple but solid, built from logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a wide porch wrapped around the front. Behind the cabin, a creek tumbled down from higher elevations, its music constant and soothing. "Built it myself," Silas said, dismounting and helping Mary Ellen down. "Took most of a summer, but it's held strong for 10 years now." Mary Ellen walked slowly around the clearing, taking it all in. There was a small barn for the horses, a shed that probably held tools and supplies, and a carefully tended garden plot where early vegetables were already pushing up through the soil. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency, of a man who knew how to provide for himself and take pride in his work. "It's beautiful," she said. "Peaceful. Come see inside." The cabin's interior was dim after the bright sunshine, but as Mary Ellen's eyes adjusted, she saw it was surprisingly spacious. A main room held a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and shelves lined with books, more books than she'd expected, on subjects ranging from agriculture to philosophy. A sleeping loft was accessible by a sturdy ladder, and a smaller room off the main space served as a pantry, its shelves stocked with preserved food and supplies. Everything was neat and well-maintained, but it was also clearly a man's space. No curtains softened the windows. No rugs warmed the plank floor. No decorative touches made it feel like a home, rather than just a shelter. "You live here alone all winter?" Mary Ellen asked, trying to imagine months of isolation in this remote place. "Most years," Silas confirmed. "Come down to town maybe twice when the weather allows. Otherwise, it's just me and the quiet. Doesn't it get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. He'd moved to stand near the window, looking out at his small domain. "But I chose this life. After the war, after seeing what I'd seen, I needed distance. Needed to remember there was more to existence than violence and destruction." "What did you see?" Mary Ellen asked gently. "In the war?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, weighted with old grief. I was at Gettysburg. Saw boys younger than Tommy Carpenter torn apart by cannon fire. Watched men I'd shared meals with die screaming in the mud. The things we did to each other." He stopped, shook his head. "I came out here to find something clean again. Something simple. Life without the cruelty." Mary Ellen crossed the room to stand beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't push for more than he wanted to share, but she stood close enough that he'd know she was there. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "You should know," Silas said. If this thing between us is going to continue, you should know what you're dealing with." "I've got scars, Mary Ellen. Not all of them show." "We've all got scars," Mary Ellen said. "Mine just came from different battles." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Mary Ellen held his gaze steadily. She saw the pain in his eyes, but also the strength. He'd survived things that would have broken lesser men, and he'd found a way to build a life afterward. "I should make some coffee," Silas said, breaking the moment. "You must be tired from the ride." While he worked at the stove, Mary Ellen explored the cabin more carefully. The books on his shelves were well read, spines creased and pages marked. She saw poetry alongside practical manuals, Shakespeare beside agricultural guides. On a small desk near the window, she found papers covered in careful handwriting. A journal, she realized, where Silas recorded weather patterns and animal sightings. "Notes on the changing seasons. You write," she said. "Surprised. Helps organize my thoughts," Silas replied, bringing 2 cups of coffee to the table. "Keeps my mind sharp when it's just me for months at a time." They sat together, drinking coffee and talking as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows. Silas told her about his first winter in the cabin, the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. Mary Ellen talked about her childhood, about growing up with 3 sisters who were all so different from each other. "Were you close?" Silas asked. "To your sisters?" "Very close when we were young," Mary Ellen said. "But they all married and moved away. 2 went back east with their husbands, 1 headed to California. I get letters sometimes, but it's not the same as having them near. That's the hardest part of the frontier," Silas observed. "How it spreads people out. Everyone searching for their own piece of land, their own chance. We end up scattered across half a continent." "Do you have family?" Mary Ellen asked. "Had a brother," Silas said. "Died at Antietam. Parents passed before the war even started. Got some cousins somewhere back in Pennsylvania, but we haven't spoken in years." He looked down at his coffee. "For a long time I told myself I preferred it that way. No ties, no obligations, freedom, and now I'm starting to think maybe I was just scared," Silas admitted. "Easier to be alone than to risk losing someone else." Mary Ellen reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I understand that fear," she said. "After James died, I swore I'd never let myself care that deeply again. It hurt too much. But you're here," Silas said. "I'm here," Mary Ellen agreed. They finished their coffee and Silas showed her the rest of his small homestead. The garden, where he grew vegetables to supplement his hunting. The creek where he caught trout in summer. The trails he'd carved through the forest for hauling firewood and checking trap lines. As they walked, Mary Ellen found herself imagining what it would be like to live here, to wake up to the sound of the creek and the wind in the pines. It was so different from town life, from the constant awareness of neighbors and expectations. "Up here you could simply be yourself. Could you teach me?" she asked suddenly. "How to live like this? How to be self-sufficient?" Silas looked at her with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You'd want to learn?" "I think I would," Mary Ellen said. "I'm tired of feeling helpless, of depending on other people's charity or goodwill. I want to know I can take care of myself no matter what happens. It's hard work," Silas warned, "especially for someone who's not used to it." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Mary Ellen said firmly. "I've been working hard for months now just to survive in town. At least up here, the work would be for myself, on my own terms." Something shifted in Silas's expression, a door opening to possibilities neither of them had quite articulated yet. "All right," he said. "I'll teach you. But we start slow. No sense trying to learn everything at once." As the afternoon wore toward evening, they began the ride back to Pine Hollow. Mary Ellen was quiet on the return journey, processing everything she'd seen and learned. Silas's cabin wasn't just a building. It represented a whole different way of living, a path she'd never considered before. When they reached town, the evening shadows were lengthening. Silas helped her dismount, his hands steady at her waist. "Thank you," Mary Ellen said, "for showing me your home, for trusting me with it." "Thank you for wanting to see it," Silas replied. He hesitated, then continued. "Mary Ellen, I know this is all happening fast. If you need time to think, to figure out what you want—" "I know what I want," Mary Ellen interrupted. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she was sure enough. "I want to keep seeing you. I want to learn from you. I want to see where this leads." Silas smiled, that rare, full smile again. "Then we'll see where it leads." He rode off into the gathering darkness, and Mary Ellen climbed the stairs to her room. Inside, she lit her lamp and sat at the small table thinking about the day. She'd seen Silas's world, understood him better, and in doing so, she'd begun to understand something about herself. She'd been thinking of survival in such limited terms, keeping her room, finding enough work, maintaining the bare minimum. But today had shown her there were other possibilities, other ways to build a life. Outside her window, the mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky. Up there, Silas was probably just arriving at his cabin, probably lighting his own lamp and settling in for the evening. The distance between them felt both vast and insignificant. Mary Ellen opened her carved box and added Eleanor Carpenter's cloth-wrapped rolls to the treasures inside. Then she pulled out paper and pen, rare luxuries she'd been hoarding, and began to write a letter to her sisters. She'd been too ashamed to write before, too conscious of her reduced circumstances. But now she had things to tell them, about a man who lived in the mountains, about rediscovering strength she'd thought she'd lost, about learning that worth wasn't measured in possessions or social standing. She wrote late into the night, the words flowing easier than they had in months, and when she finally blew out her lamp and climbed into bed, she did so with a sense of anticipation for whatever tomorrow might bring. 2 weeks passed in a pleasant rhythm. Silas came to town every few days, sometimes staying for supper that Mary Ellen prepared in Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, sometimes just walking with her through the meadows beyond Pine Hollow, where wildflowers were blooming in profusion. He began teaching her practical skills, how to identify edible plants, how to read weather patterns in the clouds, how to move quietly through the forest. Mary Ellen discovered she had an aptitude for this kind of learning. Her hands, which had grown soft during her years of comfortable married life, were developing calluses again. Her body, which had grown weak from months of inadequate food and worry, was getting stronger from the walks and the work. She was also working more hours at Pemberton's general store, and the extra income meant she could afford better meals, could set aside a small savings against future trouble. For the first time since James's death, Mary Ellen felt like she was building something rather than just surviving. It was on a Thursday afternoon, while she was organizing some old inventory in the back room of the store, that she found the papers. They'd been stuffed into a crate of old ledgers and receipts, yellowed with age and water-stained around the edges. Mary Ellen almost threw them away without looking, but something made her pause and smooth out the top sheet. It was a deed. She recognized the format from her own house deed, the one she'd lost when Blackwell foreclosed. This one was made out to James Graves, dated March of 1872, more than a year before his death. Mary Ellen's hands began to shake as she read the details. James had filed a mining claim on a property in the mountains east of Pine Hollow, in the high country near where Silas's cabin stood. The claim was properly registered with the territorial office, the filing fee paid in full, all the legal requirements met. Her husband had owned a mining claim, and he'd never mentioned it to her. Mary Ellen sat down heavily on a crate, her mind racing. Why would James file a claim and say nothing? Mining was risky business, she knew that. Many claims yielded nothing. Had he meant it as a surprise if he found something valuable? Or had he thought it too uncertain to mention until he knew more? She read through the other papers in the bundle. There were assay reports from a territorial surveyor dated 6 months before James's death. The surveyor had found promising mineral deposits, silver mostly, with traces of gold. Nothing spectacular, but potentially profitable if properly worked. The last document was a partially completed letter in James's handwriting. The paper was water damaged, the ink smeared, but Mary Ellen could make out enough to understand. "My dearest Mary Ellen, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the papers I should have shared with you long ago. I meant to tell you about the claim 100 times, but I wanted to be sure first. I wanted to surprise you with good news rather than burden you with another uncertainty. The surveyor says there's silver in those hills, enough to give us security for our old age. I've been working the claim in secret, a few hours here and there when I could spare the time. It's slow going alone, but I believe in time it will pay off. The claim is yours now, all legal and proper. Don't let anyone tell you different. The filing number is..." The letter ended there, the rest torn away or dissolved by water damage. But Mary Ellen had read enough. James had been working a mining claim in secret, trying to build them a more secure future. And he died before he could tell her. She sat in the back room for a long time, holding the papers and feeling a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude that James had thought of their future. Frustration that he'd kept such an important secret. Grief that he'd never gotten to share it with her. And underneath it all, a growing excitement. She owned a mining claim. She owned property. She wasn't just the poor widow everyone pitied. She was a property owner with potentially valuable assets. Mary Ellen carefully folded the papers and tucked them into her apron pocket. She'd need to show them to someone who understood such things. Someone who could tell her if the claim was still valid and what it might be worth. She'd need to show them to Silas. That evening, as she was closing up the store, Mr. Pemberton noticed her distraction. "Something on your mind, Mary Ellen?" She hesitated, then decided he deserved to know. He'd been kind to her, and he'd been James's friend. "I found some papers today," she said slowly. "Old documents in the back room. They seem to show that James filed a mining claim before he died." Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "A claim? I never heard James mention any such thing." "Neither did I," Mary Ellen admitted. "But the papers look legitimate. I was thinking of asking Silas to help me locate the actual site, see if there's anything to it." "That's smart thinking," Pemberton said. "Silas knows that country better than anyone. If James filed a claim up there, Silas can find it." He paused, then added carefully, "You should be aware, though, news like this tends to travel fast in a small town. If word gets out that you might own valuable property, you'll have folks coming out of the woodwork with their hands out." "I'll be careful," Mary Ellen promised, but being careful proved harder than she anticipated. When she showed up at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house the next morning for work, she found the older woman in an unusual state of agitation. "There's a man here to see you," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight. "Showed up first thing this morning. Says he's got business with you regarding a property matter." Mary Ellen's stomach sank. "What man?" "Says his name is Blackwell." Marcus Blackwell was the wealthiest man in Pine Hollow, owner of the largest working mine in the territory and half the commercial properties in town. He was the man who'd held James's debt, who'd foreclosed on their house when Mary Ellen couldn't pay. He was smooth-spoken and well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from always getting what he wanted. Mary Ellen found him waiting in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, sitting in the best chair as if he owned it. He stood when she entered, offering a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Graves," he said warmly, "how good to see you looking so well. I understand congratulations are in order." "I don't know what you mean," Mary Ellen said carefully. "Come now, no need for modesty. Word travels fast in Pine Hollow. I heard you've discovered that your late husband filed a mining claim." "That's wonderful news, truly." Blackwell's smile widened. "I actually came to offer my assistance." "What kind of assistance?" "Mining is a complex business, Mrs. Graves. It requires capital for equipment, knowledge of extraction techniques, connections for selling the ore. A widow operating alone would face significant challenges." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I'd like to offer you a partnership." I'll provide everything needed to develop the claim, workers, equipment, expertise. In exchange, I'd take a modest percentage of the profits. Say 75%? 75%. Mary Ellen kept her face neutral, but anger flared in her chest. That seems like quite a large percentage, Mr. Blackwell. It reflects the significant investment I'd be making, Blackwell said smoothly. And really, 25% of a working mine is far more valuable than 100% of an unworked claim. You'd be getting the better end of the deal. I'll need time to think about it, Mary Ellen said. Blackwell's expression hardened slightly. Of course, but don't take too long. Mining claims can be tricky things, legally speaking. If there's any question about the proper filing procedures, any irregularity in the paperwork, the claim could be challenged. I'd hate to see you lose everything because of a technicality. The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. If Mary Ellen didn't accept his terms, Blackwell would find a way to take the claim from her entirely. I understand, Mary Ellen said, keeping her voice level despite the fury building inside her. I'll give your offer due consideration. After Blackwell left, Mrs. Patterson came into the parlor. That man's a snake, she said bluntly. Don't trust a word he says. I don't, Mary Ellen assured her. But I need to understand my options. She spent the rest of the morning working mechanically, her mind occupied with the problem. By noon, she'd made a decision. She changed into practical clothes and walked to the edge of town, where Silas had told her he'd be working on the trail maintenance. She found him clearing fallen branches from a path, his shirt damp with honest sweat. When he saw her expression, he immediately set down his axe. What's wrong? Mary Ellen pulled the papers from her pocket and handed them to him. I found these yesterday at the store. They show that James filed a mining claim before he died. I didn't know anything about it. Silas read through the documents carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. When he finished, he looked up at her with understanding in his grey eyes. This claim is in the high country, he said. Not far from my place, actually. I've seen evidence of someone working there. Old dig sites, tool marks. Never knew who'd done it. Can you help me find it? Mary Ellen asked. I need to know if it's real, if there's actually anything there. And I need to know before Blackwell finds a way to take it from me. Blackwell's already approached you. Silas's voice had gone hard. Mary Ellen explained the morning's encounter, including Blackwell's thinly veiled threat about legal technicalities. By the time she finished, Silas's jaw was tight with anger. That's how he operates, Silas said. Finds vulnerable people, makes them think they need him, then takes everything they've got. He did the same thing to the Hansen family 2 years ago. They discovered copper on their property, and within 6 months, Blackwell owned the whole lot. I won't let him do that to me, Mary Ellen said firmly. I won't give him James's claim without a fight. You won't have to fight alone, Silas said. We'll go up there tomorrow, assess the site properly. If there's value in that claim, we'll make sure it stays yours. That night, Mary Ellen couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about James and his secret project. She wished he were here to explain, to tell her what he'd been planning. But he wasn't, and she had to navigate this alone, or rather with Silas's help. The thought of Silas brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the mining claim. In the weeks since the dance, he'd become someone she relied on, someone she trusted. More than that, if she was honest with herself. The feelings growing between them were becoming harder to deny or dismiss. But first, she had to deal with the claim. She had to protect what James had left her, had to prove to Blackwell and everyone else in Pine Hollow that she was stronger than they thought. As dawn broke over the mountains, Mary Ellen rose and dressed in her sturdiest clothes. She packed water and food, tucked the deed papers safely in her pocket, and headed out to meet Silas. Whatever they found at James's claim, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. The time for being invisible, for accepting other people's judgment of her worth, was over. Mary Ellen Graves was going to fight for what was hers. The ride to James's mining claim took most of the morning. Silas led the way along trails that grew increasingly rough and narrow as they climbed into the high country. Mary Ellen followed on Daisy, the gentle mare picking her way carefully over rocks and roots. They passed through zones of vegetation, from the juniper scrub of the lower elevations up through pine forests, and finally into the sparser growth near the timberline. The air grew thinner, cooler, and Mary Ellen found herself breathing harder with the exertion. "Not much farther," Silas called back to her. "According to the claim coordinates, we're close." Another 20 minutes of riding brought them to a narrow valley tucked between two ridges. A small creek ran through it, probably fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The valley sides were rocky and steep, the kind of terrain that might hide valuable mineral deposits. Silas dismounted and helped Mary Ellen down. Together, they searched the area, looking for signs of James's work. It didn't take long to find them. Near the creek, partially hidden by brush that had grown up in the past year, was a mine entrance, or rather, the beginning of one. Someone had excavated about 15 feet into the hillside, shoring up the tunnel with rough timber supports. Tools lay scattered nearby, a pickaxe with a broken handle, a shovel, a rusted bucket. Mary Ellen stood at the tunnel mouth, staring into the darkness. James had been here. Her husband had spent hours in this remote place, digging into the mountain, dreaming of a better future for them both. The thought brought tears to her eyes. He was working it alone, Silas observed, examining the site with a practiced eye. Must have taken him months to get this far. "It's dangerous work for one man. Why didn't he tell me?" Mary Ellen asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why keep it secret?" "My guess," Silas said gently. "He wanted to be sure first. Then have pride, Mary Ellen. He probably didn't want to raise your hopes unless he knew it would pay off." Mary Ellen wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders. "Can you tell if there's actually anything here? If the claim is worth fighting for?" Silas found a lantern among the scattered tools, still with oil in it. He lit it and ventured into the tunnel, moving carefully. Mary Ellen waited outside, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, Silas emerged, his expression thoughtful. "There's silver ore in there," he said. "I can see the veins running through the rock. Not huge deposits, but steady. With proper equipment and consistent work, this could be profitable. Not a fortune, but enough to live comfortably." Mary Ellen felt relief wash over her. The claim was real. James hadn't been chasing a fantasy. There was actual value here. "However," Silas continued, his tone growing serious, "developing this properly will take resources. Equipment, at minimum. Maybe hired help if you want to speed things up. And that's where Blackwell becomes a problem." "How so?" "You need capital to develop a mine. Most people in your position have to take on investors or partners. Blackwell knows that. He's counting on you not having the money to do this alone, which means you'll have to come to him or someone like him for help." "Is there another option?" Mary Ellen asked. Silas was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. "There might be," he said slowly. "I've got some savings put away. Not a fortune, but enough to buy basic equipment. And I know this country, know how to work safely in conditions like this. If you were willing to split the work and the profits, we could develop this claim together. No outside investors needed." Mary Ellen looked at him in surprise. "You'd do that? Risk your savings on my dead husband's claim?" "I'd be risking it on you," Silas corrected. "On us. And it wouldn't just be charity. I'd expect a fair share of whatever we find. Partnership terms, all legal and proper." The offer was generous, but Mary Ellen heard what Silas wasn't saying directly. A business partnership would tie them together in undeniable ways, would make their relationship a matter of public record. In a town like Pine Hollow, that would be as good as a declaration of serious intent. "I need to think about it," Mary Ellen said. "Not because I don't trust you, but because this is important. I need to be sure I'm making the right choice." "That's smart," Silas agreed. "Take whatever time you need. Just remember, Blackwell's not a patient man. The longer you wait to give him an answer, the more likely he is to try something else." They spent another hour at the site, with Silas showing Mary Ellen what he'd seen in the tunnel and explaining what would be needed to develop the claim properly. As he talked, Mary Ellen found herself watching him, the way his hands moved when he explained something. the patient tone he took when making sure she understood, the respect he showed for her intelligence and ability to grasp complex concepts. This man, she thought, was unlike anyone she'd ever known. James had been good and kind, but he'd also been conventional, content to work for wages and dream small dreams. Silas was different. He'd built a life entirely on his own terms, answering to no one. And yet here he was, offering to help her not out of pity, but out of genuine partnership. On the ride back to town, as the afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, Mary Ellen made her decision. "I want to accept your offer," she said. "The partnership." "If you're serious about it." Silas reined in his horse and turned to look at her. "I'm serious. Then yes, let's develop the claim together. Equal partners in everything, work, risk, and profits." Something shifted in Silas's expression, a deepening of the connection that had been building between them for weeks. "Equal partners," he agreed. "We'll draw up proper papers, make it all legal." "Blackwell won't like it," Mary Ellen said. "No," Silas agreed. "He won't." They arrived back in Pine Hollow as evening was falling. Word had clearly spread about Mary Ellen's discovery because people were watching them more openly than usual. Mrs. Finch stood on her porch with her daughters, her expression pinched with disapproval. But other faces were friendlier. Mayor Hutchins nodded a greeting, and the carpenters waved from their yard. At the general store, Mr. Pemberton was waiting. "Need to talk to you," he said to Mary Ellen, his expression serious. "Blackwell's been around town today, making noise. Says he's got legal grounds to challenge your claim. Something about improper filing procedures." "He's bluffing," Silas said flatly. "Those papers are in perfect order. I checked them myself." "Maybe so," Pemberton agreed. "But Blackwell's got money for lawyers, and lawyers can make all kinds of trouble even when they're wrong. Just wanted you to know what you're up against." Mary Ellen felt her resolve harden. "Let him try. I'm not backing down." That night, after Silas had left to return to his cabin, Mary Ellen sat in her room and wrote out her thoughts. She'd started keeping a journal since finding James's unfinished letter, needing somewhere to sort through the complicated emotions that kept surfacing. She wrote about the mining claim and what it meant. Not just the potential income, but the independence it represented. She wrote about Silas and their emerging partnership, both business and personal. And she wrote about fear, because underneath all the determination and newfound strength, she was still afraid. Afraid that Blackwell would find a way to take everything. Afraid that she was moving too fast with Silas, letting hope override caution. Afraid that she'd lose this chance at a new life, just as she'd lost everything else. But fear, Mary Ellen wrote, wasn't a good enough reason to give up. She'd been afraid for months now, and where had that gotten her? Alone, poor, invisible, no more. She was going to fight for what was hers, and she was going to fight with everything she had. The next morning, Mary Ellen was opening the general store when a well-dressed man she didn't recognize approached. He introduced himself as William Porter, attorney at law, representing Mr. Marcus Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell wanted me to review the documentation regarding your late husband's mining claim," Porter said, his tone professionally pleasant. "There appear to be some irregularities that need to be addressed." "What kind of irregularities?" Mary Ellen asked, keeping her voice steady. "Technical matters regarding the filing date and the survey boundaries. Nothing that can't be resolved, but it will require a proper legal review. Mr. Blackwell has generously offered to cover the costs of such a review, which could otherwise be quite expensive for someone in your position." Mary Ellen understood the veiled threat. Either accept Blackwell's partnership offer or face expensive legal proceedings that could drain her resources and potentially invalidate the claim entirely. "Tell Mr. Blackwell I appreciate his concern," Mary Ellen said carefully. "But I have my own representation, and will be handling any legal matters ourselves." Porter's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your own representation? May I ask who?" "Mayor Hutchins used to practice law before he went into politics," Mary Ellen said, the idea coming to her even as she spoke. "I'm sure he'll be happy to review the documentation and ensure everything is in order." It was a gamble, She didn't know if Mayor Hutchins would actually agree to help her, or if he had the legal expertise to stand up to Blackwell's lawyers. But she couldn't let Porter see weakness or uncertainty. "I see," Porter said, his pleasant expression cooling slightly. "Well, you'll be hearing from us formally once we've completed our review." "Good day, Mrs. Graves." After he left, Mary Ellen's hands were shaking. She'd just essentially declared war on the most powerful man in Pine Hollow. There would be consequences, but she'd also just discovered something important about herself. She was tired of being afraid, tired of letting powerful men dictate her life. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall. At midday, when she took her break, Mary Ellen walked to the mayor's office. Hutchins listened carefully as she explained the situation, his expression growing more serious as she detailed Blackwell's tactics. "He's playing a familiar game," Hutchins said when she finished. "Intimidation through legal complexity. The truth is, your claim is probably solid. I'd need to see the papers to be sure, but from what you've described, James followed all the proper procedures. Then why is Blackwell pushing so hard?" "Because he knows the claim is valuable, and he wants it." Hutchins leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Here's what I can do. I'll review your documentation, make sure everything's genuinely in order. If there are any technical issues, we'll fix them before Blackwell's lawyers can exploit them. And I'll file a formal statement with the Territorial Land Office confirming the validity of your claim. You'd do that for me?" "I'd do it because it's right," Hutchins said firmly. "Blackwell's been using these tactics for years, and it's time someone stood up to him. Besides, you've got the law on your side, Mary Ellen. We just need to make sure you're protected." Mary Ellen felt tears of gratitude threatening. "Thank you, Mayor Hutchins. I don't know how to repay you. No repayment necessary. Just promise me something when this claim starts producing. You'll remember the little people in this town who helped you along the way." That evening, as Mary Ellen was walking back to her room, she encountered Clara Jensen, the young widow who'd been watching her and Silas with such longing at church. Clara was perhaps 25, pretty in a delicate way, and she'd lost her husband to a logging accident the previous year. "Mrs. Graves," Clara said, her voice soft. "I hope I'm not being too forward, but I wanted to tell you something." "Of course," Mary Ellen said. "What is it?" "I've been watching you these past few weeks, watching how you've handled everything, the gossip, the poverty, now this business with the mining claim. You're so strong, so brave." "I wish I could be like that." Mary Ellen looked at the younger woman with surprise. She'd never thought of herself as particularly brave or strong. She'd just been surviving, making the best choices she could with limited options. "You're stronger than you think," Mary Ellen said gently. "We all are. We just don't know it until we're tested. Mr. Boone is lucky to have found you," Clara said. "He's a good man. I hope you'll be very happy together." After Clara left, Mary Ellen stood in the street for a long moment, thinking about what the young widow had said. She and Silas weren't officially courting, hadn't made any formal declarations, but clearly the whole town had already decided their future. The thought was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Maybe it was time to stop worrying about what people thought and start focusing on what she wanted. And what she wanted, she was beginning to realize, was a future with Silas Boone. Not because she needed rescuing, but because she genuinely liked and respected the man he was. That night, Mary Ellen slept better than she had in days. Tomorrow, she'd meet with Mayor Hutchins to review the claim papers. Tomorrow, she'd continue working at the store, building her savings. Tomorrow, she'd take another step toward the future she was beginning to envision. But tonight, she let herself simply rest, secure in the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, she had options, and most importantly, she had herself, stronger and more capable than she'd ever imagined she could be. The fight with Blackwell was just beginning. But Mary Ellen Graves was ready for it. The week that followed was tense with anticipation and preparation. Mayor Hutchins reviewed Mary Ellen's claim documents thoroughly, confirming what Silas had already told her. Everything was in perfect legal order. James had been meticulous in his filing, following every territorial requirement to the letter. Armed with this confirmation, Hutchins filed the necessary statements with the Land Office, formally establishing Mary Ellen's ownership beyond any reasonable challenge. He also drafted a partnership agreement between Mary Ellen and Silas, spelling out their equal shares in both the work and profits from the claim. "This makes it clean," Hutchins explained as they reviewed the document in his office. "No question of impropriety, no suggestion that you're being taken advantage of. It's a straightforward business arrangement between equal partners." Mary Ellen signed her name carefully, aware that she was binding herself to Silas in ways that went beyond simple friendship. When Silas added his signature below hers, their eyes met, and Mary Ellen saw in his gaze the same awareness, the same understanding of what this represented. Blackwell's response came 3 days later. Mary Ellen was working at the general store when William Porter, Blackwell's attorney, arrived with official-looking documents. Mr. Pemberton called her to the front, his expression grave. "Mrs. Graves," Porter said with false courtesy, "I'm here to inform you that Mr. Blackwell is filing a formal challenge to your mining claim. He contends that your late husband's original survey was improperly conducted, which invalidates the claim boundaries. We have documentation suggesting the claim overlaps with property Mr. Blackwell already owns." Mary Ellen took the papers he offered, scanning them quickly. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the intent was clear. Blackwell was trying to claim that James's property was actually part of Blackwell's existing holdings. "This is false," Mary Ellen said firmly. "The survey was properly conducted by a territorial surveyor. We have the documentation." "Documentation can be disputed," Porter replied smoothly. "Mr. Blackwell has his own survey from a more recent date that shows a different boundary line. The matter will need to be resolved in territorial court, which could take months. Expensive months, I might add." There it was, the real threat. Even if Mary Ellen ultimately won, the legal process would drain her resources and prevent her from working the claim during the dispute. However, Porter continued, "Mr. Blackwell remains willing to settle this matter amicably. His previous partnership offer still stands. Accept it, and all legal challenges will be withdrawn. Tell Mr. Blackwell," Mary Ellen said, her voice hard with suppressed anger, "that my answer is no. It was no yesterday, it's no today, and it will be no tomorrow. I will fight his challenge in court if necessary, but I will not give him what he's trying to steal." Porter's pleasant expression finally cracked, showing the cold calculation beneath. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Graves. Mr. Blackwell always gets what he wants in the end. You'd be wise to accept the inevitable. Get out of my store," Mary Ellen said quietly. After Porter left, Mr. Pemberton came over and squeezed her shoulder. "That took courage," he said. "Most people cave when Blackwell turns on the pressure." "I'm not most people," Mary Ellen replied, though her hands were trembling. Word of the confrontation spread through Pine Hollow within hours. That evening, Mary Ellen found herself with unexpected visitors. The Carpenter family arrived at her room just after dinner, Eleanor carrying a basket of food. "We wanted you to know we stand with you," Eleanor said firmly. "Blackwell's been bullying people in this town for too long. It's time someone said enough." Other townspeople came by over the following days. Some brought food or small gifts. Others simply offered words of encouragement. Even Mrs. Patterson, not usually given to emotional displays, told Mary Ellen she was proud of her. But not everyone was supportive. Mrs. Finch and her circle made their disapproval abundantly clear. They whispered loudly whenever Mary Ellen passed, made pointed comments about women who didn't know their place, and generally did everything they could to make her uncomfortable. Mary Ellen ignored them. She had bigger concerns than Adelaide Finch's opinion. Silas came down from his cabin more frequently during this period, ostensibly to help with preparations for working the claim, but actually, Mary Ellen suspected, to make sure she was all right. His presence was steadying, a reminder that she wasn't facing Blackwell alone. On Sunday, when they attended church together, Reverend Morgan's sermon seemed particularly pointed. He spoke about David and Goliath, about how faith and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. "When we face giants," the Reverend said, his voice ringing through the small church, We must remember that size and power are not the same as righteousness. The strong do not always prevail. Sometimes it is the humble, the faithful, the determined who triumph. After the service, the Reverend pulled Mary Ellen aside. "I want you to know that the church supports you," he said quietly. "If you need character witnesses for any legal proceedings, you'll have them. Plenty of them." The kindness of these gestures moved Mary Ellen deeply. For months, she'd felt isolated, dismissed as irrelevant. Now people were rallying to her cause, seeing in her struggle something larger than one woman's claim to a piece of mountain property. She was becoming, Mary Ellen realized, a symbol. Her fight against Blackwell represented something important to Pine Hollow. The idea that ordinary people could stand up to wealth and power, that dignity and determination mattered more than money. It was a heavy responsibility, but she was determined not to let them down. A week after Porter's visit, on a cool morning when mist still hung in the valleys, Mary Ellen and Silas rode out to the claim site. They'd purchased basic mining equipment with Silas's savings: picks, shovels, buckets, rope, and proper timber for shoring up the tunnel. "We'll start small," Silas explained as they unloaded the supplies. "Work safely, take our time. The silver's not going anywhere." They spent the day organizing the site, clearing away brush, and assessing what repairs the tunnel needed. It was hard, physical labor, but Mary Ellen found satisfaction in it. Every swing of the axe, every rock moved, every timber set in place was a tangible act of defiance against Blackwell's attempts to take what was hers. As the afternoon sun slanted across the narrow valley, they took a break beside the creek. Mary Ellen sat on a flat rock, drinking water and watching Silas examine a piece of ore he'd chipped from the tunnel wall. "It's good quality," he observed, turning the rock in his hands. "James had a good eye for promising sites. I wish I'd known about this place while he was alive," Mary Ellen said. "I could have helped him. We could have worked it together." "You're working it now," Silas pointed out. "Making his dream real. That's a kind of honor to his memory." Mary Ellen considered this. She'd been so focused on her grief and loss that she hadn't thought about it that way. But Silas was right. By developing the claim, she was completing what James had started, ensuring his efforts hadn't been for nothing. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me with this, for everything." Silas set down the oar and looked at her directly. "Mary Ellen, I need to say something. Been thinking about it for a while now, trying to find the right words." Mary Ellen's heart began to beat faster. "All right. When I first came to that dance," Silas said slowly, "I told myself I was just doing a decent thing, helping someone who needed help. But that wasn't entirely true, or at least it wasn't the whole truth." "What was the whole truth?" "I'd been watching you for months before that night," Silas admitted, "seeing how you handled losing everything. How you kept your dignity, even when folks treated you poorly. I admired that, admired you, and I wanted—" He stopped, searching for words. "I wanted to know you better, to be part of your life." Mary Ellen felt warmth spreading through her chest. "I'm glad you crossed that floor. The thing is," Silas continued, "somewhere along the way, this stopped being about admiration or even friendship. I've developed feelings for you, Mary Ellen, strong feelings. And I know it's maybe too soon, you being widowed and all, but I needed you to know where I stand." Mary Ellen looked at this man who'd changed her life so completely in just a few weeks. He was waiting for her response, his weathered face open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "It's not too soon," she said quietly. "I have feelings for you too, Silas, have had for a while now. I was just afraid to acknowledge them, afraid it meant I was being disloyal to James's memory." "Loving again isn't disloyal," Silas said gently. "James wouldn't want you spending the rest of your life alone." "No," Mary Ellen agreed. "He wouldn't." She took a breath, committing herself. "I don't know what this becomes, you and me. We're still figuring each other out, but I want to find out. I want to see where it leads." Silas's face broke into that rare, full smile. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. They sat that way for a long time, holding hands beside the creek in the mountain valley, while the sun moved lower in the sky and the shadows grew longer. Eventually, they packed up their supplies and prepared for the ride back to town. But something had shifted between them. A door opened to possibilities neither had quite allowed themselves to imagine before. As they rode down out of the high country, Mary Ellen felt lighter than she had in months. The fight with Blackwell wasn't over. In fact, it was probably just beginning in earnest. But she didn't feel afraid anymore. She felt ready. Whatever came next, she'd face it with Silas beside her. And that made all the difference. They reached Pine Hollow as evening settled over the valley, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. At the general store, Silas helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "Tomorrow I'll talk to Hutchins about the legal strategy," he said. "Make sure we're prepared for whatever Blackwell tries next." "Thank you," Mary Ellen said. Then, on impulse, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "For everything." Silas touched the spot where she'd kissed him, his eyes warm. "I'll see you tomorrow." Mary Ellen climbed the stairs to her room, her heart full. Inside, she lit her lamp and opened her carved wooden box. Looking at the treasures inside, the pressed wildflowers, the letters, the small mementos of a life that was changing in fundamental ways, she pulled out paper and pen and began to write another letter to her sisters, telling them about the mining claim, about the legal battle, and yes, about Silas. She wanted them to know she was all right, more than all right. She was discovering who she was when everything else was stripped away, and she liked that person. Outside her window, the mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky. Up there, in those high valleys and hidden places, lay her future, uncertain perhaps, but full of possibility. Mary Ellen finished her letter, sealed it carefully, and set it aside to mail in the morning. Then she prepared for bed, more tired than she'd been in weeks, but satisfied with the day's work. She was building something new, not just a mine or a business, but a life. A life that was truly hers, shaped by her own choices and her own strength, and that, Mary Ellen thought as she drifted towards sleep, was worth fighting for. The legal battle with Blackwell escalated over the following weeks. Porter filed formal challenges to the claim's validity, arguing that survey boundaries were imprecise and that James had failed to meet certain filing requirements. Each challenge was more technical than the last, clearly designed to overwhelm Mary Ellen with complexity and legal fees. But Blackwell had miscalculated in two significant ways. First, he'd underestimated Mayor Hutchins, who proved to be a skilled and tenacious legal advocate. The former attorney methodically countered each of Blackwell's arguments with evidence and territorial law, building an ironclad case for Mary Ellen's ownership. Second, and more importantly, Blackwell had underestimated the community's reaction. Pine Hollow was tired of watching their wealthiest citizen bully and manipulate people. Mary Ellen's stand had inspired something, a quiet but growing resistance. The resistance manifested in small but meaningful ways. When Blackwell's men tried to intimidate witnesses who could testify to James's proper claim procedures, those witnesses came forward anyway. When Blackwell attempted to pressure the Territorial Land Office to slow-walk Mary Ellen's paperwork, Mayor Hutchins called in favors from his years in politics and got it expedited. When Porter tried to schedule hearings at times when Mary Ellen would be unable to attend, the Carpenters and others offered to cover her shifts so she could be present. Through it all, Mary Ellen and Silas continued working the claim. They established a routine 3 days a week spent at the mine site, carefully extracting silver ore and expanding the tunnel. The rest of the time devoted to their respective jobs in town and the ongoing legal preparations. The work was hard, but rewarding. They were making real progress, pulling out ore that assayed well and promised good returns once they had enough to sell. More than that, they were learning to work together, developing the kind of seamless partnership that came from trust and mutual respect. It was during one of these work days at the mine, with summer beginning to settle over the high country, that they found the second vein. Silas was examining the far wall of the tunnel, looking for the best place to expand, when his pickaxe broke through to a cavity in the rock. Cool air rushed out, And when he held up the lantern, they both saw it, a natural cavity in the mountain, its walls gleaming with rich silver deposits. "Sweet heaven," Silas breathed. "Mary Ellen, come look at this." She joined him at the cavity entrance, and even her untrained eye could see that this was something special. The silver here wasn't just in scattered veins, but in concentrated deposits, the kind that could be extracted efficiently and profitably. "This changes everything," Mary Ellen said, her voice shaking with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "If Blackwell finds out about this, he'll double his efforts to take the claim," Silas finished grimly. "Which means we need to move fast. Get this ore out, get it assayed officially. Establish production records that prove the claim's value beyond any doubt." They worked harder over the next 2 weeks than Mary Ellen had ever worked in her life. Dawn to dusk at the mine site, extracting ore, carefully documenting everything, preparing samples for the territorial assayer. Her hands developed new calluses, her muscles ached constantly, and she fell into bed each night exhausted, but she'd never felt more alive. The assayer's report, when it came, confirmed what they'd hoped. The new vein represented significant value, enough to make Mary Ellen's claim one of the more profitable in the territory. With proper development, it could provide a comfortable living for years. "We need to tell Hutchins immediately," Silas said when they received the report. "Get this on the record before Blackwell can interfere." They rode to town that same day, the precious report tucked safely in Mary Ellen's saddlebag. But as they approached Pine Hollow, they saw unusual activity. Horses tied up outside the general store. People gathered in concerned-looking groups. "Something's happened," Mary Ellen said, feeling dread settle in her stomach. They found Mr. Pemberton in the store, his expression grave. "There's been an accident at Blackwell's main mine," he said. "Cave-in this morning. 3 men trapped, maybe more. They're trying to dig them out now." Mary Ellen felt her anger at Blackwell war with her human compassion. Whatever her feelings about the man, miners trapped underground was a tragedy that transcended personal disputes. "How can we help?" Silas asked immediately. "They're calling for anyone with mining experience to assist with the rescue." "You know tunnel work, Silas. They could use you." Silas looked at Mary Ellen, clearly torn between helping with the rescue and staying to protect her interests. She made the decision for him. "Go," she said firmly. "Those men need you. I'll take the assay report to Mayor Hutchins and make sure it's filed properly." "You go help with the rescue." Silas nodded, squeezed her hand briefly, then headed out toward Blackwell's mine at a run. Mary Ellen found Mayor Hutchins at his office, already aware of the accident and preparing to go oversee the rescue efforts. But he took time to review the assay report, his eyes widening as he read the figures. "This is substantial," he said. "This puts your claim in the top tier of producing mines in the territory. Blackwell's going to fight even harder when he learns about this." "I know," Mary Ellen said, "but it's mine. James found it, I'm developing it, and I'm not giving it up." "Good," Hutchins said, his expression admiring. "I'll file this immediately with the territorial office. Once it's on record, Blackwell can't suppress it or claim it doesn't exist." The rescue at Blackwell's mine took all afternoon and into the evening. The whole town turned out, some to help, others to wait anxiously for news of the trapped miners. Mary Ellen found herself at the mine site as dusk fell, part of a group of women providing food and water to the exhausted rescue workers. She watched Silas work alongside other men, his mining knowledge invaluable as they carefully shored up the damaged tunnel and worked to reach the trapped miners. He was covered in dirt, sweat streaming down his face, but he never stopped, never flagged. Finally, just after dark, a cheer went up. They'd reached the trapped men. All 3 were alive, injured but alive. As they were brought out on makeshift stretchers, relief swept through the crowd. Blackwell himself was there, directing operations, and Mary Ellen saw him notice her presence. For a moment, their eyes met across the chaos of the rescue site. His expression was complex. Anger, grudging respect, and something that might have been weariness. He made his way through the crowd toward her, and Mary Ellen steeled herself for confrontation. But when Blackwell spoke, his voice was surprisingly level. "Mrs. Graves, thank you for your assistance here tonight." "I came to help the miners," Mary Ellen said carefully. "Not you." "Even so." Blackwell looked at Silas, who had emerged from the tunnel and was making his way toward them. "Your partner did good work today. His knowledge of tunnel safety likely saved lives." It wasn't quite an apology, but coming from Marcus Blackwell, it was close. "I'm glad we could help," Mary Ellen said. "I hope your men recover fully." Blackwell nodded, then surprised her by adding, "I received word about your new assay report. The rich vein you discovered." He paused as if the next words cost him effort. "It's a legitimate find. A good one. Are you withdrawing your legal challenges?" Mary Ellen asked, not daring to hope. "I'm considering it," Blackwell said carefully. "Porter tells me our case is weak and getting weaker. Hutchins has been quite effective in his defense. And this accident today, it reminds me that some things matter more than business disputes." He looked at the mine entrance, where his injured workers were being tended to. "I've been in this business long enough to know when I'm beat. Your claim is solid, Mrs. Graves. I'll instruct Porter to drop the challenges." Mary Ellen felt relief wash over her so intensely she almost swayed. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell." "Don't thank me," he said with a hint of his old sharpness. "You won this fair and square. You stood your ground and fought smart. I can respect that, even if I don't like losing." He walked away, back toward his injured miners, leaving Mary Ellen standing in the dust and lantern light, hardly believing what had just happened. Silas reached her, filthy and exhausted, but with a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "Did I just hear what I think I heard?" "He's dropping the challenges," Mary Ellen confirmed, her voice shaking with emotion. "The claim is really mine, really ours." Silas pulled her into an embrace, not caring about the dirt or the watching crowd. Mary Ellen held him tight, feeling tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. They'd won. Against all odds, against wealth and power and legal intimidation, they'd won. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them too exhausted and emotionally wrung out for much conversation. But as they approached the general store, Silas spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the future, about what comes next." "So have I," Mary Ellen admitted. "The claim's going to need regular work. Someone should probably live up there, at least during the mining season. Keep an eye on things, work it steady." "That makes sense," Mary Ellen said, not sure where he was going with this. "My cabin's not far from the claim site. It would be practical to use it as a base of operations." He paused, then continued carefully. "It would be even more practical if there were two people living there. Partners working together, sharing the labor and the profits and everything else." Mary Ellen's heart began to race. "Silas, are you asking—" "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me," Silas said, the words coming out in a rush, now that he'd committed to them. "I know it's fast, and I know folks will talk about it being too soon after James, but I love you. Mary Ellen, I want to build a life with you up in those mountains, working that claim and making something good together. If you need more time, I understand. But I wanted you to know where I stand." Mary Ellen looked at this man who'd crossed a dance floor to offer her his hand, who'd stood by her through legal battles and hard work, who'd helped her remember she was strong and valuable and worth fighting for. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Silas's face transformed with joy. He helped her down from her horse and kissed her properly, right there on the street, not caring who might see or what they might say. Mary Ellen kissed him back, tasting dust and sweat and the promise of a future she'd never imagined 6 weeks ago when she'd stood invisible in the corner of a dance hall. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. "Tomorrow I'll talk to Reverend Morgan," Silas said. "See how soon he can perform the ceremony." "Tomorrow sounds perfect," Mary Ellen agreed. She climbed the stairs to her room for what she knew would be one of the last times. Soon she'd be packing up her few belongings, leaving this small space above the general store and moving to a cabin in the high country. She'd be Mrs. Silas Boone, partner in a profitable mining claim, wife to a good man, building a life on her own terms. Inside, she opened her carved wooden box and added the latest treasure, the assay report that had secured her future. Then she sat at her table and wrote one more letter to her sisters, telling them about Silas's proposal, about the resolution of the legal battle, about everything that had changed. "I'm happy," she wrote. "Truly, genuinely happy in ways I never expected to be again. The road here was hard, but it taught me things about myself I needed to learn. I'm stronger than I knew. I'm capable of more than I imagined. And I am worthy of love and respect and a good life, regardless of what I own or wear or how society judges me." She sealed the letter and set it aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new beginnings. But tonight, she let herself simply sit in gratitude for how far she'd come and anticipation for where she was going. Outside her window, the mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, waiting. Her future was up there, in those high valleys and hidden places, and she was ready to claim it. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in Pine Hollow's small church. It was a simple ceremony, nothing like the elaborate affair Mary Ellen's first wedding had been. But it was perfect in its own way. Mary Ellen wore a new dress, not fancy, but clean and pretty, made of blue calico with small white flowers. The fabric had been a gift from Eleanor Carpenter and the other women of Pine Hollow, who'd pooled their resources to give Mary Ellen something special for her wedding day. She'd wept when they'd presented it to her, overwhelmed by the kindness. Silas wore his best shirt, freshly pressed, his hair neatly trimmed and his face clean-shaven. He looked almost uncomfortable in his formal clothes, but when he saw Mary Ellen walking down the short aisle toward him, his expression softened into something that made her heart flutter. The church was nearly full. The Carpenter family occupied an entire row, little Sarah bouncing with excitement despite her mother's attempts to keep her still. Mayor Hutchins and his wife were there, as were Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house had come, along with many of the townspeople who'd supported Mary Ellen through her struggles. Even Clara Jensen was there, her eyes bright with vicarious happiness. Mrs. Finch and her circle were notably absent, but Mary Ellen found she didn't care. The people who mattered were present, and that was enough. Reverend Morgan performed the ceremony with warmth and genuine joy, speaking about partnership and mutual respect, about building lives on firm foundations of trust and love. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed Mary Ellen gently, and the congregation erupted in applause. Outside the church, well-wishers gathered to congratulate them. There were embraces and handshakes, words of encouragement and advice, genuine happiness radiating from the community that had rallied around Mary Ellen in her time of need. "You take care of her." "Silas Boone," Eleanor Carpenter said, wagging a finger at him with mock sternness. "She's special." "I know," Silas replied simply, his hand finding Mary Ellen's. "And I will." The Carpenters hosted a modest reception at their home, not elaborate, but filled with good food, laughter, and fellowship. Mary Ellen moved through it all in a kind of joyful haze, accepting congratulations and well wishes, feeling surrounded by genuine warmth. At one point, she found herself standing with Silas on the Carpenter's porch, watching the children play in the yard while adults visited in small groups. "Happy?" Silas asked quietly. "Very," Mary Ellen replied. "You? More than I ever expected to be," Silas admitted. "When I came down that mountain 6 weeks ago, I never imagined things would turn out like this. What made you come?" Mary Ellen asked, a question she'd been curious about since the beginning. "What made you decide to go to that dance?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'd been watching you around town for months," he said finally, "seeing how you carried yourself, how you treated people even when they treated you poorly. Something about you called to me, your strength, your dignity. And then I heard you were planning to attend the dance, and I thought, what?" Mary Ellen prompted when he paused. "I thought maybe someone should remind you that you mattered," Silas said, "that you were worth seeing. So I came down and I crossed that floor and—" He smiled. Here we are," Mary Ellen echoed, leaning against his solid warmth as the afternoon wore on. Mary Ellen said her goodbyes to the people and places that had been her world for the past difficult months. She thanked Mr. Pemberton for his kindness and the work he'd given her. She hugged Mrs. Patterson and promised to visit when she came to town. She assured the carpenters that they'd always be welcome at the cabin. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Mary Ellen and Silas rode out of Pine Hollow together, heading east toward the mountains that would be their home. They rode in comfortable silence, the kind that comes between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. The trail climbed steadily, winding through familiar country now, past the meadow where they'd gathered wildflowers and up toward the high country where Silas's cabin waited. They arrived as twilight was settling over the valley. Silas had made preparations. The cabin was clean and organized, with fresh wood stacked by the fireplace and supplies laid in. He'd even picked wildflowers and placed them in a jar on the table, a gesture so uncharacteristically domestic that it made Mary Ellen smile. "Welcome home," Silas said, helping her down from her horse. Home. The word settled over Mary Ellen like a blessing. This place, so different from anything she'd known before, felt right in ways she couldn't fully articulate. It was remote and rustic, demanding and beautiful, and it was hers. They spent their first evening as husband and wife sitting on the cabin's porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The creek's music provided a constant backdrop, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. "I should probably tell you," Silas said eventually, "living up here isn't always easy. Winters are hard. Sometimes we'll be snowed in for days at a time. It's a lot of work, keeping a place like this running." "I'm not afraid of work," Mary Ellen said, "and I'm not afraid of the isolation. After months of being watched and judged in town, having some privacy sounds wonderful. We'll still go down regularly," Silas assured her. "For supplies, for church, to see friends. I don't want you feeling trapped up here." "I won't feel trapped," Mary Ellen said with certainty. "I'll feel free." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, then Silas stood and offered Mary Ellen his hand. "Getting cold out here. Should we go inside?" Mary Ellen took his hand and let him help her to her feet. Together they went into the cabin, closing the door on the night and opening the door on their shared future. The weeks that followed established their new rhythm. They worked the claim 3 days a week, extracting silver ore and carefully managing their developing operation. The other days were spent on cabin maintenance, hunting, tending the garden, and the countless other tasks required for self-sufficient mountain living. Mary Ellen discovered she had a natural aptitude for this life. Her hands learned to work leather and mend tools, to preserve food and manage supplies. Silas taught her to track game and read the signs of changing weather, to recognize the plants that could nourish or heal, to move through the forest with confidence. In turn, Mary Ellen brought her own skills to their partnership. She organized their supplies more efficiently than Silas ever had, creating systems that made their work smoother. She cooked meals that were more than just functional, adding flavor and variety to their diet. She brought books and reading to their long winter evenings, sharing stories and ideas that sparked conversations lasting late into the night. They learned each other slowly, discovering preferences and habits, accommodating quirks, and building the deep familiarity that comes with shared daily life. There were moments of friction, times when they had to work through disagreements or misunderstandings. But they approached these challenges the same way they approached everything else, as partners committed to finding solutions together. Summer turned to autumn, painting the high country in brilliant golds and reds. They made several trips to town during this period, selling their accumulated ore and purchasing supplies for the winter ahead. Each visit confirmed what Mary Ellen already knew. Her life had fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond marriage or property ownership. She walked through Pine Hollow now, with her head high, no longer the invisible poor widow, but a respected member of the community. Mrs. Finch still sniffed disapprovingly when they passed, but even Adelaide's power to wound had diminished. None's opinion of someone so small-minded simply didn't matter anymore. In October, Mary Ellen received letters from all 3 of her sisters responding to the news of her remarriage. All three wrote with joy and relief, happy to know she'd found love again and built a new life. The younger sister even mentioned plans to visit the following summer, wanting to see this mountain country Mary Ellen had described so vividly. As winter approached and the first snows began to dust the peaks, Mary Ellen and Silas made their final preparations. They laid in supplies for months of isolation, stacked wood high against the cabin walls, and secured the mine entrance against the weather. The claim had proven profitable beyond their initial hopes. They had savings now, security against future hardships, resources to expand their operation when spring came. On a cold November evening, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, Mary Ellen sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace while Silas read aloud from one of his books. She was mending one of his shirts, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, and she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a different person. Broken by loss, diminished by poverty, convinced her life was effectively over at 32. Now she was strong, capable and happy in ways she'd never imagined possible. The change hadn't been easy or simple. It had required courage she didn't know she possessed, determination that surprised even her, and the willingness to be vulnerable again after loss had made her want to hide forever. But most importantly, it had required the simple but profound act of being seen. Silas had seen her when she was invisible. He'd offered his hand when she stood alone. He'd reminded her that worth didn't come from possessions or social standing, but from character and heart. And in being seen by him, Mary Ellen had finally learned to see herself, to recognize her own strength and value, to understand that she deserved respect and love and a good life regardless of external circumstances. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked, looking up from his book to find her watching him. "About that dance," Mary Ellen said, "about how different everything is now compared to 6 months ago." "Better?" Silas asked, though the question was mostly teasing. He knew the answer. "So much better," Mary Ellen confirmed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible when I was standing in that corner, trying to be invisible." "You could never be invisible," Silas said seriously, setting down his book. "Not to anyone who was really looking. You shine too bright for that." Mary Ellen set aside her mending and crossed to where Silas sat. She settled onto his lap, his arms coming around her automatically, and they sat together watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountain in quiet white. The wind moved through the pine trees with its voice like distant water. The creek, beneath its growing skin of ice, sang its eternal song. And inside the cabin, warm and secure, two people who'd found each other against all odds sat in perfect contentment, building a life together one day at a time. Years later, when people in Pine Hollow told the story, and they did tell it again and again, the tale growing with each retelling, they would frame it as a romance. The mountain man who'd walked into a dance and chosen the poorest woman in town, defying social expectations and convention. But Mary Ellen knew the truth was both simpler and more profound than that. It wasn't a rescue, it was a recognition. Silas hadn't saved her. He'd simply seen her, really, truly seen her, and in that seeing had helped Mary Ellen remember how to see herself. She'd saved herself. One difficult choice at a time, one act of courage after another. She'd stood up to bullies and fought for what was hers. She'd learned new skills and discovered hidden strengths. She'd built a life on her own terms. Silas had walked beside her through it all, steady and supportive, but the strength had been hers all along. And that, Mary Ellen thought, as she sat in her mountain cabin with her husband's arms around her and the future stretching bright before them, was the real story worth telling. Not about being rescued, but about being reminded of your own power. Not about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone who recognized you were already whole. Not about dependence, but about partnership between equals. The snow fell, the fire burned, the mountains stood eternal guard over their small valley. And Mary Ellen Graves Boone, once invisible but now gloriously, undeniably seen, smiled into the warmth and peace of her hard-won life, grateful for every step of the difficult journey that had brought her home.